The wind howled across the North Sea, cold and sharp, carrying with it the smell of salt and fear. Picture it, a small village on the coast of what is now England, quiet and half asleep, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. The farmers had just started tending to their fields. Women carried baskets of bread to bake for the day, and children laughed as they chased each other near the water's edge. No one suspected that this peaceful morning would be torn apart within moments. The sea was calm, but beneath that calm, history was about to shift in the most brutal way. Viking sails, those dreaded, dragon-headed ships, were cutting through the mist, silent and deadly, gliding closer with every breath of wind. And for those on shore, there was no warning, no chance to prepare, only the rising panic when the first horn echoed across the bay. The reality of Viking raids was far from the romantic tales of adventure we often hear. It wasn't just about warriors and horned helmets, though they never wore those horns, by the way. It was about survival, fear, and the harsh truth of life in a world where power meant everything. These raids were fast, merciless, and planned with cold precision. The Vikings came not just for treasure, but for food, for land, and often for people, villagers taken away as slaves, families torn apart in moments. Imagine standing in that village, hearing the clash of metal and the screams of your neighbors, knowing there was nowhere to run. That was the reality, and that's where our story begins. This isn't going to be one of those heroic Viking tales where every warrior is brave and every raid is glorious. No, this is the human side of it, the real side. Ordinary people, not warriors, caught in the middle of history's tide. A young fisherman named Edric, for example, had never even held a weapon. His life was about pulling nets from the sea, repairing boats, and dreaming of a good harvest. His wife, Alwyn, spent her days tending to their small garden, her hands always smelling of herbs and fresh earth. They had 2 children, both still young enough to cling to her skirts when strangers passed by. To them, the world was simple and safe until the day the ships came. And what about the Vikings themselves? They were not all the same, not all heartless killers. Some were desperate men, forced into raiding because their own lands couldn't feed them. Others were ambitious, hungry for wealth, determined to carve out a better life no matter the cost to others. Among them was Bjorn, a young warrior with doubts creeping into his mind every time he saw the terror in villagers' eyes. But doubts didn't matter when you were part of a crew. The rules were simple: raid, take what you can, leave before anyone could fight back. Mercy was weakness, and weakness meant death, not just for you, but for your whole crew. Bjorn's hands were calloused from rowing, his arms strong from swinging an axe. But his heart, well, that's something we will talk about later. The first wave of panic always started the same way. The ships would appear suddenly, too close to outrun, and the village bells, if there were any, would ring too late. Men would grab whatever tools they had, pitchforks or fishing spears, to stand against trained warriors carrying shields and axes. Women would rush to gather their children, hiding them in cellars or beneath straw, praying the raiders would pass by. But rarely did they pass by. The Vikings moved quickly, burning storage barns, stealing food, tearing through doors looking for silver, gold, or anything of value. And in the middle of that chaos, people like Edric had to choose: fight and likely die, or run and abandon everything they owned. What made Viking raids so terrifying wasn't just their violence. It was their unpredictability. They struck without warning, appearing in places no one thought possible. Coastal monasteries, peaceful riverside towns, even deep inland villages that thought themselves safe. The raids were like storms, here one moment, gone the next, leaving only smoke, ash, and broken lives behind. But as much as the raids were feared, they were also strangely admired. Whispers spread of their skill, their daring, the way they traveled across oceans as if the sea itself belonged to them. For some young men in those villages, there was even a secret envy, a wondering of what it might feel like to live free, to hold that kind of power. But for most, that thought vanished the moment they saw a burning roof or heard the crack of an axe splitting wood, and sometimes bone. Back on the shore, that morning, Edric stood frozen as the first longship scraped onto the sand. The men jumped out quickly, shields raised, axes gleaming, their boots splashing in the shallow water. Alwyn screamed for him to run, to take the children, but his feet felt like they were rooted to the earth. Bjorn, among the first to leap onto the beach, caught his eyes for a split second. There was no smile, no joy in his face, just a hard, focused stare, the kind of stare that comes from doing something you wish you didn't have to do, but can't stop. And then the chaos began. We often think of history as dates and kings and battles, but the truth lies in these moments. Ordinary people facing choices they never wanted to make. Do you run, leaving everything behind, or do you fight, knowing it might cost your life? And what about the raiders themselves? Were they only monsters, or were they also trapped by their own world, their own need to survive? These are the questions that turn history into something human, something real. And that's what we're going to explore tonight. Not just the raids themselves, but the lives behind them. How they started, why they happened, and how they changed the world in ways no one could have imagined. Because the Vikings didn't just take, they left behind fear, yes, but also new trade routes, new cultures mixing, and even new ways of life. But right now, in this story, we are still on that beach, with Edric frozen in place and Bjorn's axe raised. The screams are rising, the smoke is curling into the morning sky, and history is about to change forever. But here's the thing, we don't yet know what happens next. Does Edric survive this raid? Does Bjorn spare him? Or does this day mark the beginning of something much larger, something that will pull both of them into a story far beyond this one attack? That's where we'll pick up next time, because the brutal reality of Viking raids was not just about one village, one morning, or one battle. It was about an entire world caught in the tide of change, and for some, there was no turning back. The air was thick with smoke now, curling up from burning thatched roofs and filling the morning sky with a dull, choking haze. Edric's chest rose and fell as if he'd been running, but he hadn't moved. He could feel the heat from the nearest house as it caught fire, hear the muffled sobs of someone hiding behind a cart, and the harsh shouts of the raiders speaking in a language he didn't understand. His wife's voice finally broke through the noise, sharp and panicked. Edric, the children. That was what snapped him out of his frozen state. He turned just as a group of Vikings rushed past, their boots kicking up sand, their shields banging against their sides like drums of war. Alwyn was already dragging their children toward the small storage hut behind their house. Her hands shook as she shoved them inside, whispering hurried promises that she would be right back, that it was just for a moment. But the truth hung heavy in her voice. She didn't know if there would be a right back. Edric grabbed her arm, pulling her close for a moment, his eyes darting to the approaching figures. Bjorn was among them, his axe resting against his shoulder, his gaze scanning the area for valuables, for resistance, for danger. He didn't look like a man enjoying this. His jaw was tight, his expression cold, but there was something almost reluctant in his steps. The other Vikings didn't hesitate. One of them smashed open a wooden chest outside the hut next door, spilling grain into the dirt, laughing as if it were a game. Another kicked open a door, dragging out a terrified man who begged for mercy, only to be thrown aside when they found nothing worth taking. The raids weren't always about killing, unless someone fought back. It was about speed, about taking as much as they could carry and leaving before anyone could organize a defense. But fear had a way of making people fight, even when they had no chance. A young man from the village, barely older than a boy, ran toward the raiders with a pitchfork raised high. His cry was desperate, full of anger and terror, but it ended quickly when one of the Vikings slammed him aside with a shield. He hit the ground hard, the air rushing from his lungs, and the Viking didn't even stop to look back. To them, he was just another obstacle in the way. Edric watched, his stomach twisting. He wanted to help, to do something, but what could he do against men trained for this? Men who had crossed an ocean for this very purpose. Bjorn's crew moved with practiced efficiency, some entering houses, some keeping watch. He stopped near Edric's home, his eyes landing on the storage hut where Alwyn had hidden the children. Edric's heart pounded so loud it drowned out the rest of the noise. For a moment, Bjorn simply stared, his hand tightening on his axe. Then their eyes met again, and something unspoken passed between them. Fear, recognition, or maybe just the silent understanding of two men who didn't want to be where they were. But that moment couldn't last. One of Bjorn's crewmates called to him, tossing a bag of stolen silver his way. Bjorn caught it, glanced once more at Edric, and moved on. Olwen exhaled shakily, her hands gripping Edric's sleeve. "We can't stay here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "If they search the hut," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Edric nodded, his mind racing. The woods behind the village might offer safety, but reaching them meant crossing open ground, exposed to the raiders. Staying meant hoping they wouldn't look too closely. Neither choice felt safe, but they had to choose soon. Meanwhile, on the beach, more ships were arriving. The sound of oars splashing into the shallows mixed with the cries of villagers. The Vikings rarely came in small numbers. They arrived in waves, each ship carrying men hungry for plunder. Bjorn's leader, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Rold, shouted orders in a booming voice, his presence commanding respect from his crew. Unlike Bjorn, Rold seemed to enjoy the chaos, his grin wide as he oversaw the raid. "Take everything," he barked. "Quickly. The tide won't wait for us." His voice carried across the village, striking panic deeper into anyone still hiding. For Bjorn, every raid felt heavier than the last. He had joined the crew young, like many others, lured by promises of wealth and adventure. But the reality was different. He saw too much fear in too many faces, and though he told himself it was necessary, that his own family depended on the silver he brought back, he couldn't escape the guilt creeping into his thoughts. He caught sight of a little girl clinging to her mother's dress as they crouched behind a half-collapsed wall, and his steps faltered for just a second. Rold noticed, narrowing his eyes, but said nothing yet. Edric finally made his choice. Grabbing Olwen's hand, he whispered, "We run." Now, there wasn't time to think about the house, the fishing nets, or the life they were leaving behind. The children were all that mattered. They darted toward the woods, keeping low, moving behind fences and carts to stay hidden. Each step felt like it took a lifetime, every sound a possible betrayal of their escape. Olwen clutched the children, urging them to stay quiet, her breath coming in quick gasps. Bjorn spotted them as they moved. For a brief moment, he hesitated, his hand tightening around his axe. He could call out, stop them, take them as captives like Roll would want. Captives meant profit, and profit meant survival for his crew. But something in him rebelled. He turned away, pretending not to see, focusing instead on a nearby house that his crew had already looted. Let them go, he thought, though he knew if Roll noticed, there would be consequences. The woods were close now, just a short run away. Edric glanced back once, seeing Bjorn watching the other way, and felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they could make it. Maybe this wouldn't be the end. But just as they reached the edge of the trees, a shout rang out behind them. One of the other raiders had seen the movement, pointing his sword in their direction. "There," he yelled. Edric's heart dropped. Olwen clutched the children tighter, her eyes wide with fear. They had only seconds to decide, keep running and risk being chased, or turn back and hope for mercy. Bjorn turned sharply at the shout, his jaw clenching as he realized what had happened. Rold was already moving toward them, his grin returning as he raised his axe. "Bring them back," he ordered. And just like that, the brief hope that had sparked in Edric's chest began to fade. The woods were so close, the smell of pine already in the air, but the heavy footsteps behind them grew louder. Bjorn's expression hardened, torn between his duty to his crew and something else, something he couldn't yet name. He tightened his grip on his axe, his eyes locked on Edric, and for a moment, it was impossible to tell what he would do next. The cries of the villagers mixed with the sound of burning wood, the cold wind carrying the scent of salt and smoke. And in that frozen second, with life and death hanging in the balance, history shifted again, waiting to see whether mercy or duty would win in Bjorn's heart. Edric's breath came in short, desperate gasps as he pushed Olwen and the children forward. The woods were only a few steps away now, but the pounding footsteps behind them grew louder. He didn't dare look back again, afraid that doing so would slow him down, afraid that if he saw how close the raiders were, his legs might stop working altogether. Alwyn clutched their daughter, her arms trembling from both fear and exhaustion, while their son tried to keep up, his small legs stumbling over the uneven ground. "Run!" Edric urged, his voice breaking. His hand pressed firmly against Alwyn's back, as if his willpower alone could carry them to safety. The trees stood ahead like a wall of hope, the shadows of the forest offering what little protection they could imagine. If they could just get past that first line of trees, maybe, just maybe, they could disappear into the thick undergrowth before the raiders caught them. Behind them, the shouting grew clearer. The Viking who had spotted them, an older man with a scar down his cheek, pushed forward through the sand, swinging his sword as if cutting through invisible enemies. "Don't let them escape," he yelled in his own language, his words harsh and sharp. Rold, close behind, was grinning as though he had already caught them, his axe glinting in the morning light. Bjorn followed at a slower pace, his steps heavier, more reluctant. He didn't shout, didn't join the chase with the same eager energy as the others. His eyes stayed locked on the fleeing family, his jaw tight with something that wasn't excitement. He had been in this exact situation before, countless times, but this time something was different. Maybe it was the way Edric kept glancing back, not with anger or defiance, but with raw, human fear. Or maybe it was the way Alwyn shielded her children, even as she stumbled, refusing to let them fall. Something about them felt too familiar, too close to the life Bjorn had left behind when he chose this path. Edric reached the first line of trees, shoving Alwyn ahead of him. "Keep going," he urged. The underbrush scratched at their legs, branches tugging at their clothes as they pushed deeper. The forest smelled of damp soil and pine, a sharp contrast to the smoke and fire they had left behind. But the woods were not going to protect them if the raiders followed. These men were hunters as much as they were warriors, and they were used to tracking prey through forests. A loud crash behind them made Alwyn stumble. She turned her head just in time to see Rold bursting into the trees, his heavy boots snapping branches underfoot. "There's nowhere to run," he roared, his voice filled with a cruel excitement. The scarred Viking was close behind, his sword already raised. Edric pulled Alwyn behind a thick tree trunk, pushing the children behind them, trying to make themselves small, invisible. His heart raced so fast it felt like it might break out of his chest. He reached for a fallen branch, the only weapon he could find, gripping it tightly even though he knew it wouldn't stand a chance against steel. His hands shook, but his eyes burned with a quiet determination. If this was the end, he would at least stand between the raiders and his family. Bjorn entered the woods seconds later, his pace steady, but his expression conflicted. His fellow raiders were laughing, shouting to one another as if this were a game. To them, chasing down fleeing villagers was sport. But to Bjorn, every step felt heavier. He could hear the children crying softly, the sound cutting through him more sharply than any blade. Rold spotted Edric first. With a grin, he raised his axe high, stepping closer, his movements slow and deliberate, enjoying the fear that spread across Edric's face. "Out of hiding, fisherman," Rold said in his own language, though the tone was clear enough. "You've got something worth taking, don't you? A family, strong arms. Maybe you'll fetch a price, maybe you won't." Edric didn't move, his grip tightening on a branch. Alwyn pressed the children closer, whispering to them to keep quiet, though their trembling bodies made silence almost impossible. Bjorn stepped closer, his gaze locked on Rold, his hand tightening around his axe handle. This was the moment where he had to decide, stay silent and let this play out as it always did, or step in and risk everything. Rold was a leader, a man who didn't tolerate disobedience. To go against him in front of the crew would be dangerous, maybe even fatal. But Bjorn's chest felt tight, his thoughts spinning with memories of his own family back home. His younger sister hiding under a table during a raid years ago, his mother screaming for mercy when their village was attacked by other raiders before he ever became one of them. Rold stepped closer to Edric, lifting the axe a little higher. We take them, he barked to the scarred Viking. The man will work, the woman too. The children. He didn't finish his sentence, but his grin said enough. That was it. Bjorn's decision came before he could think it through. His axe shot out, blocking Rold's swing before it could strike. The clash of metal against metal echoed through the woods, startling everyone. Rold's grin disappeared, replaced by shock, then anger. What are you doing? Rold barked, stepping back just enough to glare at Bjorn. The scarred Viking froze, unsure whether to move or wait for orders. Bjorn's jaw tightened. They're not worth it, he said in a low voice, choosing his words carefully. We've already taken enough. The tide's turning. We need to leave before more men from inland come. His tone was steady, almost cold, as if he were making a practical decision, not a moral one. But his eyes betrayed him, glancing briefly toward the family huddled behind a tree. Rold narrowed his eyes, stepping closer, his massive frame looming over Bjorn. You're telling me what we take now? Since when do you give orders, boy? His voice dripped with threat, his fingers flexing around his axe handle. The woods fell silent, except for the sound of distant screams back in the village. The scarred Viking shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two men. Bjorn stood his ground, his axe still raised, though his heart raced in his chest. He couldn't back down now, not without giving himself away completely. Edric held his breath, his body pressed tightly against the tree, watching the two Vikings face each other. He didn't understand their words, but he understood the tension. For the first time, there was a chance, just a small one, that they might live. Rold's stare lingered on Bjorn for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a scoff, he lowered his axe, though his expression was far from calm. Fine, he growled, his tone filled with annoyance. But you'll explain to the crew why we leave silver on the table. He turned sharply, motioning for the scarred Viking to follow. We're done here. Back to the ships. Bjorn didn't relax until Rold disappeared through the trees. His grip on his axe loosened slightly, but his body stayed tense. He turned his head just enough to meet Edric's eyes again. There was no smile, no comfort, just a silent warning. Stay hidden. Don't move until we're gone. Alwyn's fingers clutched Edric's arm as they both stared back at Bjorn, unsure whether to trust him, unsure whether he might change his mind. Bjorn held their gaze for only a moment longer before following the others back toward the beach, his steps heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. The sound of retreating footsteps faded, replaced only by the crackling of burning roofs in the distance. Edric didn't move for several minutes, his heart still pounding, waiting until he was sure the raiders were truly gone. Only then did he pull Alwyn and the children into his arms, their relief breaking into quiet, shaky sobs. But as the smoke rose over the ruined village, one thing became clear: the Vikings would return. This raid might be over, but it was only the beginning. And somewhere in the back of his mind, Bjorn knew it too. He might have spared this family, but how long could he keep making choices like this before someone noticed? How long before Rold's patience ran out? The tide was pulling out, the longships gliding away into the open sea, but the shadow they left behind lingered over the land. The next raid might come in a week, a month, or even a year, but it would come. And for both Edric and Bjorn, this one encounter had set something in motion that neither of them could stop. Edric held Alwyn and the children tightly, his arms wrapped around them as if his grip alone could keep them safe. The forest was quiet now, except for the distant cries from the burning village and the soft rustle of leaves above. The smell of smoke still clung to them, mixing with the damp earth beneath their feet. Alwyn's face was streaked with dirt and tears, but she forced herself to stay quiet, her body trembling as she pressed their children closer. Edric's mind spun wildly. They had survived for now, but survival felt fragile, like a thin thread that could snap at any moment. They stayed crouched there for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes, until the faint sound of oars splashing against water finally faded. The Vikings were leaving. Edric's heart pounded as he listened carefully, afraid it might be a trick, afraid they might return for one last search. But slowly, the forest grew still again, save for the occasional crack of burning wood in the distance. When he was sure the raiders were gone, Edric finally exhaled. His hands shook as he pulled away, just enough to look at Alwyn's face. "We're safe," he whispered, his voice hoarse, though his eyes betrayed doubt. Safe was temporary. Everyone knew that once the Vikings discovered a village, they often came back, again and again, until there was nothing left to take. Alwyn didn't answer right away. She looked toward the village, her lips trembling, and then back at the children, who clung to her with wide, frightened eyes. "What about everyone else?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Edric hesitated. He thought of the neighbors they had known all their lives. The baker who always saved a bit of bread for the children, the old shepherd who told stories by the fire on cold nights. He thought of the boy with the pitchfork who had tried to fight back, struck down before he even had a chance. His chest tightened. "We can't go back." "Not yet," he said firmly. "It's too dangerous." Alwyn nodded, though tears welled in her eyes. She understood, even if it broke her heart to leave friends behind. They had to think of the children now. Back on the beach, the longships were already cutting through the waves, their dragon-headed prows slicing through the water with graceful precision. The crew worked quickly, their movements practiced as they stowed bags of silver, food, and other goods. Laughter and shouts carried across the water, but not everyone shared in the victory. Bjorn sat near the edge of the ship, his axe resting across his knees, his eyes fixed on the shrinking outline of the burning village. The smell of smoke still clung to his clothes, but it was the memory of the family's terrified faces that weighed on him most. He had done what he could, spared them when he had the chance, but the guilt lingered. How many others had he not spared before? How many times had he turned away, pretending not to hear the screams? Rold moved across the deck, his booming laugh echoing as he inspected the loot. He slapped one of the younger raiders on the back, praising him for the silver he had found, his grin wide and unrepentant. "A good raid," Rold said loudly, making sure everyone heard. "The gods favor us today." Bjorn said nothing. His silence didn't go unnoticed. Rold stopped near him, tilting his head slightly. "You've been quiet," he said, his tone almost teasing, but with a hint of warning beneath it. "Not proud of what we've done today." Bjorn kept his gaze on the horizon. "We took enough," he replied calmly. There was no need to waste time chasing those who had nothing left to give. Rold narrowed his eyes, crouching slightly, so his face was closer to Bjorn's. "Enough? There's never enough. That's what keeps us alive. That's what keeps your family fed back home. Or have you forgotten why you're here?" His words were sharp, cutting deeper than Bjorn wanted to admit. Bjorn clenched his jaw, but didn't answer. Rold smirked, straightening up again. "Remember your place," he said before turning away, barking orders at the rest of the crew. The longship rocked gently as it glided farther from the shore. Bjorn tightened his grip on his axe, his thoughts heavy. He told himself he was doing this for survival, for his family, for the harsh winters back home that left so many starving. But the truth gnawed at him. Every time he saw the fear in people's eyes, it became harder to justify. Back in the woods, the sun had climbed higher, casting dappled light across the forest floor. Edric led his family deeper into the trees, careful to avoid broken branches that might give away their path if anyone returned. The children were tired, their small legs stumbling, but Edric urged them on gently. They needed to find a safe place to rest, somewhere far enough from the village that no one would find them if the Vikings came back. Alwyn followed close behind, her hand never leaving the children's shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. A snapping twig, a rustling bush. The forest, which once felt familiar and peaceful, now seemed full of unseen dangers. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing surrounded by thick bushes. Edric motioned for them to sit, keeping his eyes on the trees as he tried to listen for any signs of pursuit. The forest was quiet except for the distant call of birds. The children curled up beside Alwyn, too exhausted to speak, their eyes heavy with sleep. She stroked their hair gently, whispering soft words to calm them, even though her own heart still pounded with fear. Edric sat beside her, staring at the ground, his mind racing. "We can't stay here long," he said quietly. "If they return, they'll search everywhere. Alwyn nodded, her voice soft. Where will we go? Edric didn't answer right away. The truth was, he didn't know. Their village was gone, their home likely burned or looted. Friends and neighbors might be dead or scattered. Even if they went back, there would be nothing left. But running forever wasn't an answer either. Finally, he said, we'll wait until night. Then we'll go inland. Maybe there's another village that hasn't been touched. Maybe they'll help us. Alwyn looked at him, her eyes filled with both hope and doubt. And if the Vikings find us again? Edric didn't respond, his silence saying enough. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Bjorn sat quietly on the ship, still staring at the fading coastline. His crewmates were laughing, drinking, counting their loot, but his thoughts were far away. He kept seeing the fisherman's face, the way the man had stood ready to fight with nothing but a broken branch. It reminded him of his own father, who had died defending their home from another raiding crew years ago. The longship rocked gently, carrying them farther from the village, but Bjorn couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted today, something that might change the course of his life. He had spared one family, but how long could he keep making those choices before someone noticed? Before Roald decided he was a liability? The night wind grew colder, biting at his skin, but Bjorn stayed awake, his thoughts restless. Far away, in the darkening forest, Edric stayed awake too, clutching a stick like a weapon, his eyes fixed on the shadows, waiting for danger that might never come, or might come too soon. Two men on opposite sides of the same raid, thinking of family, of survival, of choices that would soon collide again. Because the Vikings always returned. And the next time, mercy might not come so easily. The forest grew quiet. The sea grew darker, but the story was only just beginning. The forest was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the kind of smell that usually brought comfort to Edric, but tonight it felt heavy and suffocating. He sat close to Alwyn and the children, keeping his back against a tree, his eyes scanning the dark shapes of the surrounding woods. Every rustle of leaves made him tense. Every snap of a branch sent his heart racing. The forest was quiet now, but quiet could be dangerous. He didn't trust it. The Vikings might be gone for the moment, but he knew they had not seen the last of them. Once a village was found, it was rarely left alone for long. Alwyn sat beside him, her arm wrapped protectively around the children. Their daughter had fallen asleep against her lap, her breathing soft and uneven, but their son's eyes remained open, staring at the flicker of firelight coming from the distant direction of their village. Will we ever go back? Alwyn asked quietly, almost as if speaking too loudly would draw danger closer. Edric hesitated, staring into the darkness. He pictured their small house, the fishing nets that had taken him weeks to repair, the small garden Alwyn had tended so carefully. But he also pictured the flames, the boots of the raiders stamping across their home, and the sound of crashing doors. If there's anything left to go back to, he said finally, his voice low, but even if we do, we can't stay. Not if they come again. Alwyn nodded, her lips pressed tightly together. She wanted to argue, to believe they could rebuild, but deep down she knew he was right. Life would never be the same again. Their village, once full of laughter and simple routines, was now marked. The Vikings had found it, and that meant they would return. Far across the sea, Bjorn sat on the deck of the longship, his mind far from the laughter of his crewmates. The ship rocked gently on the waves, the stars scattered across the sky above them like frozen sparks. Most of the crew had begun to drink and boast about the raid, passing cups of mead and retelling their favorite moments, exaggerating every detail for entertainment. Roald, of course, was at the center of it all, his booming laugh filling the air. But Bjorn stayed silent, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze lost in the darkness beyond the waves. The image of the fisherman and his family kept returning to him, unshakable. He had seen that same look of fear countless times before, but for some reason, it weighed on him differently this time. Maybe because it reminded him of home, of the times his own people had been raided by others before he was old enough to fight back. He remembered his mother clutching his younger sister the same way that woman had held her children. He remembered his father, standing in front of them with nothing but an old spear, trying to protect them. That memory had shaped him, pushed him toward becoming a raider himself. But now, years later, he wondered if he had simply become the very thing his father had once fought against. Rold noticed his silence eventually. He pushed through the laughing crew and crouched down beside Bjorn, his grin sharp in the dim light. "You're quiet again," he said, his voice casual, though his eyes watched Bjorn carefully. "Still thinking about the ones you let go?" Bjorn didn't answer right away. "They had nothing left worth taking," he said finally. Rold chuckled, shaking his head. "You sound like an old man worrying about fairness." "They're not our people, Bjorn. They're just, what's the word? Opportunity. Every bag of grain, every coin, every slave means another winter we survive. You think they'd show us mercy if it were the other way around?" Bjorn stayed silent, his jaw tightening. Rold leaned closer, lowering his voice so the others wouldn't hear. "I've seen you hesitate before. You're good with an axe, no one denies that. But hesitation gets men killed. You keep showing weakness, the crew will notice. And if they start to think you've lost your stomach for this, they won't trust you when it matters." Bjorn's hand tightened around the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. Rold's words were meant as a warning, but they were also a test. Bjorn knew it. He looked up at Rold finally, forcing his expression to stay calm. "I do what needs to be done," he said simply. Rold studied him for a long moment before smiling again. "Good. Keep it that way." With that, he stood and returned to the group, joining their laughter as if the conversation had never happened. But Bjorn stayed where he was, staring out at the black water. Rold's words were right in one sense. Hesitation could get men killed. But Bjorn couldn't help wondering if maybe hesitation was the only thing keeping him human. Back in the forest, Edric's mind wandered as he sat awake, his eyes scanning the shadows. He thought about the days before the raid, when life had been simple. The morning spent pulling in nets, the evenings sitting by the fire with Alwyn and the children. He had never considered himself a brave man. He wasn't a warrior, wasn't a hero. But now, sitting here in the dark, clutching a stick as if it were a weapon, he felt something growing inside him, a quiet, steady resolve. If the Vikings came back, he would have to do more than just hide. The hours passed slowly, the forest growing colder as the night deepened. The children slept curled against Alwyn, their breathing soft and even, but Edric remained awake, listening. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf howled, its cry echoing through the trees. He tightened his grip on the branch, his heart quickening, though he knew it was only an animal. His nerves were raw, stretched thin, but he couldn't let himself relax. Alwyn stirred slightly, her voice soft and tired. "You should sleep," she whispered. "I can't," Edric replied. "Not yet." He glanced toward the direction of the village, though the trees blocked any view. "I need to be ready if—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Alwyn understood. The sun would rise soon, and with it would come new decisions. Should they try to find survivors? Should they search for food before moving inland? Every choice carried risks. But for now, all they could do was wait, trapped between fear and hope, listening to the forest breathe around them. On the ship, Bjorn finally lay back against the wooden planks, staring at the stars, though sleep wouldn't come easily. The fisherman's face haunted him, not just because he had spared him, but because for the first time in years, Bjorn had felt the weight of the choices he had made. The crew believed raids were simple. Take what you can, survive another winter, but Bjorn could no longer see it as simple. Every raid left scars, not just on those who were attacked, but on the raiders themselves, even if most refused to admit it. The longship creaked softly as it cut through the water, heading toward the next settlement on their path. Rold was already planning the next attack, talking about which coastal villages were likely unprotected, which monasteries might hold silver and books worth trading. Bjorn closed his eyes, his thoughts dark. He wondered if he could keep living this way, wondering how long he could keep choosing mercy before it cost him everything. The forest grew still, the sea rolled on, and somewhere between them, the weight of unspoken choices hung heavy. For Edric, survival meant running. For Bjorn, survival meant pretending not to care. But both men knew the same truth. The Vikings would return. And when they did, neither of them would escape what was coming. The first light of dawn crept through the trees, soft and pale, spreading across the forest floor in long streaks. Edric shifted uncomfortably against the rough bark of the tree he had leaned on all night. His body ached, his eyes burned from exhaustion, but he couldn't bring himself to rest. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves made him tense, ready to spring up if needed. When the sun finally broke through the mist, he let out a slow breath, though relief felt too dangerous to embrace. Morning meant decisions, and decisions meant risk. Alwyn stirred beside him, her arms still wrapped protectively around the children. Her hair was tangled, her face streaked with dirt, but her eyes were sharp with determination. She looked toward Edric, her voice quiet. "We need to see what's left," she said. "We can't keep running forever, not without food." Edric nodded, though hesitation lingered in his mind. Going back to the village was dangerous, but she was right. They couldn't survive in the forest for long with no supplies. "We'll move carefully," he said finally. "Stay in the trees as much as we can. If there's anyone left, maybe they'll join us." The children, still half asleep, clung to Alwyn as they stood. Their small hands clutched at her dress, their eyes wide with fear, even though they didn't fully understand what was happening. Edric took the lead, stepping lightly across the forest floor, his head turning constantly to watch for movement. Every bird that took flight made his heart skip. Every shadow between the trees looked like a figure waiting to strike. The closer they came to the village, the stronger the smell of smoke became. It clung to the air, bitter and heavy, mixed with the faint scent of the sea. Edric slowed his steps, crouching low as they approached the edge of the forest where the trees thinned out. He raised a hand for Alwyn to stop, then peered through the branches. What he saw made his stomach twist. The village he had known all his life was almost unrecognizable. Several houses had burned completely, leaving only blackened frames and piles of ash. Smoke still curled from the remains of the larger storage huts, and the fishing nets that had once hung neatly by the shore were now trampled, torn, and scattered. Chickens and goats wandered aimlessly among the ruins, the few that hadn't been taken by the raiders. But it was the silence that struck him the most. No laughter, no voices, no familiar morning routines. The village felt like a ghost, hollow and lifeless. Alwyn crouched beside him, her hand gripping his arm. Her eyes were wide as she looked at what was left of their home. "Do you think anyone's alive?" she whispered. Edric scanned the village carefully. Movement near one of the houses caught his eye. At first, he tensed, afraid it might be a raider left behind. But then he saw the figure clearly, a woman, her clothes torn, limping as she tried to gather what little food she could salvage from the ruins. Relief washed over him, though it was bittersweet. If she had survived, maybe others had too. He turned back to Alwyn. "Stay here with the children," he whispered. "I'll check." Alwyn's grip tightened on his arm for a moment, but she nodded, pulling the children closer as they hid behind the trees. Edric took a deep breath, then stepped into the open, moving cautiously across the charred ground. The woman turned sharply at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes wide with fear, but when she recognized him, her shoulders sagged with relief. "Edric," she breathed, her voice hoarse. "Thank the gods. I thought everyone was gone. Who else is alive?" Edric asked, keeping his voice low as his eyes darted around, still wary of danger. "Only a few," she said. "Some hid in the cliffs by the shore. Others, I don't know. Most didn't make it." Her voice cracked as she looked toward the burned remains of a house. "They took people, Edric. Not just food and silver. They took whoever they could carry." Edric felt a cold weight settle in his chest. He had known it was likely, but hearing it confirmed was worse. His mind flashed to the moment Bjorn had locked eyes with him in the forest. He wondered how many families hadn't been so lucky, how many had been dragged onto those long ships, never to return. The woman glanced toward the trees. "Your family? They're safe for now," Edric said. "We're leaving. Inland." She nodded, her face pale but determined. "Take me with you. There's nothing left here for us." Edric agreed without hesitation. They couldn't leave anyone behind now. He motioned for her to follow him back into the forest, where Alwyn waited with the children. When Alwyn saw the woman, she embraced her tightly, relief and grief mixing in her tear-streaked face. As they regrouped, Edric looked back toward the village one last time. Smoke drifted lazily into the sky, carrying with it the final remnants of their old life. He knew he wouldn't see this place again. Far across the sea, Bjorn sat with his back against the longship's wooden side, sharpening his axe with slow, steady strokes. The crew was restless, already talking about their next target. Rold stood near the front of the ship, discussing plans with two of the older raiders, his deep voice carrying across the deck. "There's a monastery south of here," Rold said, his tone almost cheerful. "They say the monks keep silver and books. Easy prey, and no real fighters to defend it." The younger raiders cheered at the thought, but Bjorn stayed silent, his jaw tightening. Monasteries were always easy targets, but they were also full of people who couldn't fight back. He had raided many before, but lately, the thought of bursting through quiet halls filled with unarmed men made his stomach turn. One of the younger raiders, a boy barely into manhood, sat near Bjorn, his eyes shining with excitement. "Rold says this one's full of gold," the boy said eagerly. "Maybe after this raid, I can buy my own boat. Maybe even lead my own crew one day." Bjorn didn't respond, though he remembered when he had spoken the same way, years ago. He looked at the boy and felt a strange mix of pity and anger. This was what they all started as, dreamers chasing a future built on stolen lives. Rold glanced back at Bjorn, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're quiet again," he said, walking closer. "You weren't always like this, Bjorn. Don't tell me you're starting to grow soft." Bjorn looked up, meeting his gaze evenly. "I'm just thinking about the tide," he said simply. "We'll need to move quickly if we don't want to get trapped on the shore." Rold studied him for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer. But as he turned away, Bjorn caught the way Rold's eyes lingered on him just a little too long, suspicion creeping in. The longship cut through the water, heading south, but Bjorn's mind wasn't on the next raid. It was on the fishermen, on the family hiding in the woods, and on the growing question he could no longer ignore. How long could he keep pretending he was just another raider before someone forced him to prove where his loyalty truly lay? And somewhere, in the forest miles away, Edric and Alwyn moved deeper inland, joined now by a few other survivors. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to keep moving. But in the back of Edric's mind, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Anger. Not just fear, not just sorrow, but a quiet, simmering anger that whispered of change. Because surviving was no longer enough. Not anymore. The sun climbed higher through the mist, warming the tops of the trees as Edric led the small group of survivors deeper into the woods. Their footsteps were soft on the damp ground, their pace slow but steady. Alwyn carried their daughter on her hip, while their son walked close to her side, clutching her dress with one hand. Behind them, the woman they had found in the village limped slightly, her clothes torn, but she kept moving, her eyes darting nervously at every sound. Two more survivors had joined them along the way, an older man with a deep cut on his arm and a young boy who had lost his parents during the raid. The group moved in silence, as if even speaking too loudly might bring the Vikings back. But silence had its own weight. Every creak of a branch, every rustle of leaves made their hearts jump. Edric's jaw tightened as he scanned the trees ahead. He had never been a leader before, never thought he would have to be, but now all eyes were on him. Every step they took, every decision made, was his responsibility. Alwyn caught up to him, her voice quiet. "How far are we going?" Edric glanced at the trees around them, noting the thickness of the undergrowth and the slope of the land. "Far enough that they won't follow us if they come back," he said. "Somewhere we can hide, at least for a while." The older man behind them grunted. "Hiding won't keep us alive forever. They'll come again. They always come again." His voice was bitter, filled with years of experience. "You've seen what they do. We can run all we want, but it won't matter in the end." Edric slowed his steps, turning slightly to face him. "So what do you suggest?" March back and fight them with sticks and fishing knives. His tone was sharp, but his eyes softened almost immediately. I know what they are. I know what they'll do. But right now, staying alive is the only thing we can do. The older man didn't reply, though his expression didn't soften either. They kept walking until they reached a narrow clearing surrounded by thick bushes. Edric raised a hand for everyone to stop. We'll rest here, he said, only for a little while. Alwyn lowered their daughter to the ground gently, the little girl curling up against her lap almost instantly. The young boy sat close to the other children, his eyes wide and distant. The older man sat down heavily on a fallen log, clutching his injured arm, while the limping woman crouched nearby, trying to steady her breathing. Edric remained standing, his eyes scanning the trees, his mind restless. Every part of him wanted to keep moving, but he knew they needed this brief pause. As he watched the forest, a thought crept into his mind. What if this was all they would ever be now? People running, hiding, hoping not to be found. How long could anyone live like that? Across the sea, the longship sailed south, cutting through the waves with the precision of a predator. The air was crisp, the sun glinting off the water, but Bjorn barely noticed the beauty of it. He sat at the edge of the ship, his axe resting across his knees, his mind heavy with thoughts he couldn't speak aloud. The crew was loud, their spirits high after the success of the last raid. Some sharpened weapons, others cleaned the silver and goods they had taken, laughing as they compared what they had stolen. Rold stood at the center of it all, his booming voice carrying across the deck as he spoke of the monastery they planned to raid next. Bjorn's eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He could picture the monastery already. Quiet halls, unarmed men, fear written on their faces as the raiders stormed in. He had seen it before. He had done it before. But the memory of Edric and his family haunted him, refusing to let go. One of the younger raiders approached him, the same boy who had spoken to him the night before. You fought well back there, the boy said, sitting beside him. Rold says you're one of the best with an axe. Is it true you once killed 3 men in a single swing? Bjorn glanced at him, his face unreadable. It doesn't matter how many you kill, he said. The boy looked confused. Of course it matters. That's how men will remember you. That's how you earn respect. Bjorn didn't reply. He didn't have the heart to tell the boy the truth, that being remembered for killing was nothing to be proud of. Rold's voice broke through the noise. Bjorn, he called, walking toward him. His grin was sharp, but his eyes carried something colder, something calculating. You'll lead the first group when we reach the monastery. Show these boys how it's done. Bjorn looked up, forcing his expression to remain steady. As you wish. Rold studied him for a moment, his grin widening slightly. Good. I knew you hadn't gone soft. Don't make me regret trusting you. He clapped Bjorn on the shoulder before turning back to the crew. Bjorn stayed silent, his hands tightening around the handle of his axe. Trust. That was a dangerous word among men like Rold. One wrong step, one sign of hesitation, and that trust would vanish. And when it did, men like Bjorn didn't just lose respect, they lost their lives. The longship moved steadily south, its dragon-headed prow cutting through the waves. But Bjorn's thoughts were not on silver or glory. They were on choices he had already made, and choices he would soon have to make again. Back in the forest, Edric sat against a tree, his hands clasped tightly together. The children were sleeping now, their breathing soft and steady, but he couldn't let himself rest. The older man's words echoed in his mind. Running forever wouldn't work. Not for long. Alwyn sat beside him, her voice soft. What are you thinking? Edric hesitated, then spoke slowly. I'm thinking maybe running isn't enough anymore. If we keep running, we'll spend the rest of our lives hiding, waiting for them to find us again. Maybe there's another way. Alwyn looked at him, her brow furrowed. What other way? He didn't answer right away. His mind was racing, forming thoughts he had never dared to speak before. He thought of the other villages inland, of the people who had suffered like they had, of the anger building inside him with every step they took. Maybe we're not as helpless as they think we are, Edric said finally, his voice quiet but firm. There are others like us. Survivors. Farmers. Fishermen. People with nothing left to lose. If we came together. His voice trailed off, the idea still taking shape. Alwyn's eyes widened slightly, her face torn between hope and fear. "You're talking about fighting them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Edric didn't deny it. He stared into the trees, his jaw set. "I'm talking about making sure this doesn't keep happening. Not just to us, but to anyone." The forest was quiet, but his words hung heavy in the air, a promise forming in the silence. And far away, on the longship heading south, Bjorn stared at the horizon, feeling the weight of his own unspoken promise. A promise to himself that one day he would have to choose a side. The tide carried the ship closer to its next target, and the forest grew darker as the sun dipped low, but both men felt the same truth pressing down on them. The raids would not stop, not unless someone stopped them, and sooner or later their paths would cross again. The forest grew darker as evening crept in, the lights slipping away behind the thick canopy. Edric sat near the edge of the small clearing, his eyes scanning the trees as the others rested. The survivors were quiet, each lost in their own thoughts, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Alwyn sat with the children, whispering soft words to keep them calm, while the older man tended to his injured arm, wincing as he tried to clean the wound with a strip of cloth torn from his tunic. The limping woman kept to herself, staring at the ground as though the memories of what she had seen were too heavy to speak about. Edric's mind wouldn't stop turning. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the burning village, heard the screams, felt the helplessness clawing at him. But under all that fear, something else had begun to take root: anger. It pulsed inside him like a slow, steady drum. The older man had been right. Running wasn't enough. Sooner or later, the Vikings would find them again, or find another village, leaving more families shattered. As he stared into the trees, his thoughts shifted to the faces of the men who had attacked. He remembered one of them in particular, the one who had met his eyes in the forest. That moment had been strange, almost out of place in all the chaos. There had been no laughter in that man's eyes, no pride in the violence. It had been something else: hesitation, maybe even regret. Edric didn't know why it lingered in his mind, but it did. It made him wonder if all of them were truly as ruthless as they seemed. The older man broke the silence, his voice low but sharp. "You're planning something," he said, watching Edric closely. Edric glanced at him, but didn't deny it. "We can't keep hiding," he said quietly. The older man gave a humorless laugh. "And what do you plan to do? Fight them with fishing hooks and kitchen knives? You've seen what they are. Trained warriors. We'd be slaughtered before we even touched them." Edric didn't respond right away. His jaw tightened as he stared at the ground. "Maybe," he said finally, "but if we don't do something, they'll keep coming. They'll keep taking. And not just here. Other villages, too." The older man shook his head, though his eyes softened slightly. "You got a family. Think about them first. Leave the heroics to men who have nothing left to lose." Edric didn't answer. His family was the reason he was even considering it. That was what the older man didn't understand. This wasn't about glory. It was about making sure his children wouldn't spend their whole lives running and hiding. Alwyn's eyes were on him now, watching him carefully. She said nothing, but he could see the worry in her expression. She knew what he was thinking. She also knew there was no talking him out of it once he made up his mind. Across the sea, Bjorn sat at the edge of the longship as the waves rolled beneath them, the cold spray of seawater dampening his clothes. The ship creaked softly, its dragon-headed prow cutting steadily toward the southern coastline. The crew was lively, laughing and boasting about the riches they would soon take, but Bjorn sat apart, sharpening his axe slowly, his thoughts miles away. Rold moved through the crew like a wolf among hounds, his laughter loud, his confidence unshaken. He thrived in the anticipation of another raid, his eyes bright as he spoke of silver and glory. But occasionally he glanced toward Bjorn, his expression shifting for just a second, suspicion flickering behind his grin. Bjorn noticed it, of course. He always noticed. Rold wasn't a man who missed details, and Bjorn's silence was beginning to draw too much attention. He forced himself to look up when Rold finally approached. "You're too quiet again," Rold said, his tone casual but with that same sharp edge. "Thinking about the raid? Or about something else?" Bjorn kept his face calm, his voice steady. "Thinking about the tide," he said. "We don't want to be trapped on the shore when we land." Rold studied him for a moment, then nodded, though his grin returned quickly. "Good. Keep thinking like that. A cautious man lives longer than a reckless one." But he leaned closer, lowering his voice so only Bjorn could hear. "If you hesitate again, if you start questioning orders, you won't live long at all. Do you understand?" Bjorn's grip tightened on his axe, but his expression didn't change. "I understand." Rold gave a sharp smile and turned away, shouting orders to the crew. Bjorn exhaled slowly, his mind restless. The next raid would come soon, and he knew he couldn't keep playing this game forever. Every choice he made now was dangerous. Show too much mercy, and Rold would notice. Follow orders too closely, and he'd lose the last pieces of himself he still recognized. The coastline came into view as the sun dipped lower, painting the water in streaks of orange and gold. Bjorn stared at it, feeling the same tightening in his chest he always felt before a raid, but this time it wasn't excitement, it was dread. Back in the forest, night fell again, wrapping the survivors in darkness. The small group huddled together for warmth, whispering in quiet voices. The older man sat apart, his face grim, while the limping woman stared silently at the stars, lost in her own thoughts. The young boy who had lost his parents stayed close to Olwen, his small hands clutching her arm as if she were the only safety left in the world. Edric sat awake, keeping watch, his eyes fixed on the dark trees. His mind turned over possibilities, plans forming even if they still felt like wild dreams. He thought of other villages inland, of the people who might be willing to fight if given the chance. Maybe they didn't have swords or shields, but they had numbers and they had anger. Sometimes that was enough. Olwen moved closer to him, her voice soft so the others wouldn't hear. "You're not going to stop thinking about it, are you?" Edric shook his head slowly. "I can't. If we keep running, we'll never be free. Not us, not anyone." She looked at him for a long moment, then sighed, her hand brushing his arm. "If you do this, I'll stand with you. But promise me one thing, Edric. Promise me you won't do it alone." He met her eyes, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself to give a small nod. "I promise." The forest was quiet, but something had shifted among them, something unspoken but strong. Edric's resolve was no longer just a thought. It was becoming something real. And far away, on the long ship cutting through the waves, Bjorn tightened his grip on his axe, his jaw set. He didn't know how much longer he could keep following Rold. Something had to give, and when it did, he knew he'd have to choose. The tides rolled on, the forest breathed around them, and the paths of two men, one running from violence, the other trapped within it, moved slowly, inevitably toward each other. The night passed slowly, the forest alive with the quiet sounds of rustling leaves and distant animal calls. Edric sat awake, his back against a tree, the faint glow of the dying fire casting shadows across his face. Sleep tugged at his eyes, but he refused to let himself rest. Too much weight on his mind. Every time he blinked, he saw flashes of fire, the way their village had burned, the way people screamed as they were dragged away. But more than fear, something else kept him awake, an idea that was slowly turning into determination. When the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, Edric stood. The others stirred slowly, blinking against the cold morning air. Olwen stretched, pulling the children closer to her, while the older man sat up with a groan, clutching his injured arm. The young boy remained curled against the limping woman, who had kept him close through the night, her expression soft despite her own pain. Edric looked at them all, seeing not just fear, but also something deeper, something that could grow if given direction. He crouched near the older man, his voice low. "There are other survivors out there," he said. "If we find them, if we gather enough people, maybe we can stand against the next raid. We don't have to keep hiding." The older man gave him a sharp look, his brows furrowed. You're serious about this? Yes, Edric said, his voice firm. I won't let them take everything from us again. Not without trying to stop them. The older man sighed, his gaze dropping to the ground. You're talking about farmers and fishermen against trained raiders. We'd be slaughtered. Maybe, Edric admitted, but if we do nothing, we'll lose everything anyway. At least this way, we have a chance. For a long moment, the older man said nothing. Then, finally, he gave a slow nod. You'll need more than anger to win. You'll need numbers. And someone who knows how to fight. Edric's jaw tightened. Then we'll find both. Owen had been listening quietly, and when Edric glanced at her, she didn't argue. Instead, she gave him a small nod, as if to say she understood. By mid-morning, they were on the move again, heading deeper inland. The forest grew thicker, the ground uneven, but they pressed on. The young boy clung to Owen's hand, his eyes darting nervously at every sound, while the older man kept pace despite his injury. As they moved, Edric's mind worked quickly, trying to think of the villages farther inland, places the Vikings might not have reached yet. If he could convince enough people to join them, maybe they could set traps, build defenses, anything to slow the raiders down. It wasn't much, but it was something. Far across the sea, the longship glided closer to its next target. The coastline appeared in the distance, a small cluster of buildings nestled near a rocky hill, smoke curling lazily from chimneys. Bjorn sat near the front of the ship, his axe resting across his knees. The crew was alive with energy, their voices rising with excitement as they prepared for another raid. But Bjorn's stomach tightened as he stared at the village. He could already imagine what would happen. Screams, fire, the same terror he had seen so many times before. Rold stood at the center of the deck, barking orders, his grin sharp as he looked toward the shore. We'll hit the houses first, he said. Take everything you can carry. And if anyone tries to fight, you know what to do. Bjorn's grip tightened on his axe. He had killed before, many times, but each raid weighed heavier on him now. The memory of the fisherman and his family haunted him still. Their terrified faces burned into his mind. The longship slid onto the shore with a scrape of wood against sand. The raiders leapt out, their boots hitting the ground as they charged toward the village. Bjorn followed, his steps slower than the others, his chest heavy with dread. The first cries echoed through the air as the raiders stormed the houses. Doors were kicked open, belongings scattered, and people dragged into the open. A woman screamed as two raiders grabbed her, pulling her toward the ship. Bjorn froze for a moment, his axe heavy in his hand. He saw the fear in her eyes, the same fear he had seen in Edric's family. Something inside him tightened, snapping like a rope stretched too far. Bjorn! Rold's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Move! Stop standing there like a coward. Bjorn forced himself forward, but his mind was racing. Every step felt heavier, every scream sharper. He swung his axe when needed, but his strikes were slower than usual, his movements deliberate, as if trying to wound rather than kill. Rold noticed. Of course he did. He fought like a man who thrived in the chaos, his laughter loud as he cut down anyone who resisted. Between strikes, he glanced toward Bjorn, his eyes narrowing, suspicion hardening into something sharper. When the raid slowed, the crew began dragging their spoils back to the ship. Bjorn stood still, his chest rising and falling, his hands slick with sweat. Rold approached him, his grin tight, his eyes sharp. You're slipping, Rold said quietly, his voice low so the others wouldn't hear. You hesitate too much. That's not the Bjorn I know. Bjorn met his gaze evenly, though his heart pounded. I'm still here, aren't I? Rold studied him for a long moment, then gave a slow smile, though there was no warmth in it. For now, as they returned to the ship, Bjorn stared out at the sea, his mind heavier than ever. He knew Rold's patience wouldn't last forever. Sooner or later, he would be forced to make a choice, stay silent and keep his place among the raiders, or act on the growing weight in his chest and risk everything. Back in the forest, Edric and the survivors reached a stream by mid-afternoon. They stopped to drink, their movements cautious as they scanned the trees. Edric crouched near the water, splashing his face before turning to the others. We'll need to find more people, he said. Other villages, anyone who survived. If we work together, we can make it harder for them to take what they want. The older man gave him a long look. You talk like a man ready for war. Edric didn't hesitate. Maybe I am. The forest was quiet, the stream trickling softly, but the weight of his words lingered among them. This was no longer just about survival. Something had begun to change, an idea that could grow into something stronger. And far away, on the rolling sea, Bjorn sat in silence, the cries of the raid still echoing in his mind. Both men, though separated by miles, felt the same pull of fate drawing them closer to a point neither could yet see. The raids would not stop, and soon, neither of them would be able to run from what was coming. The forest stretched endlessly, a maze of twisting roots and thick undergrowth that swallowed the survivors as they moved deeper inland. The air grew cooler, the trees taller, and the sounds of the coast faded into the distance. Edric walked at the front, his steps steady, his mind focused on what lay ahead. Every now and then, he glanced back to make sure the group kept pace. Olwen, the children, the limping woman, the older man, and the young boy who clung to Olwen's side like a shadow. The path wound along a narrow ridge where the trees opened slightly, giving them a view of the valley below. Edric paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the landscape. Smoke rose faintly in the distance, not thick like a burning village, but thin, the kind that came from cooking fires. A settlement, maybe. He crouched, motioning for the others to stay quiet. There are people ahead, he whispered. We need to see who they are before we approach. If they're survivors like us, maybe they'll listen. The older man frowned. And if they're not, then we move on, Edric said firmly. Olwen gave him a small nod, her hand resting on their son's shoulder. Be careful, she whispered. Edric slipped away through the trees, keeping low as he moved toward the smoke. His heart pounded as he drew closer, but not from fear. This was hope, fragile but real. If they could find allies, even a few, maybe this plan wouldn't just be a dream. When he reached the edge of the clearing, he saw a small group of people gathered near a fire. Their clothes were worn, their faces pale and tired, but they didn't look like raiders. They looked like villagers. Some carried crude spears, others clutched tools that had been turned into makeshift weapons. They were on edge, their eyes scanning the forest nervously. Edric stepped out slowly, his hands raised to show he carried no weapon. The people turned sharply, spears lowering toward him, but he didn't move. I'm not here to harm you, he said, his voice steady. We're survivors. Our village was raided 2 nights ago. We escaped. A man stepped forward, his face lined with exhaustion, but his grip firm on the spear in his hand. Where's the rest of your people? Some are with me, Edric replied. We're heading inland, looking for others. We can't just keep running. If we don't stand together, they'll keep coming back. Village after village. The man exchanged glances with the others. A woman near the fire lowered her makeshift weapon slightly. You're talking about fighting them, she said, her voice uncertain. Edric nodded. I am. The man's brow furrowed. You think farmers and fishermen can stand against them? You've seen what they are. They're trained, ruthless. They've been fighting their whole lives. I know, Edric said, stepping closer. But we know these lands better than they do. We know the forests, the hills, the rivers. If we work together, we can trap them, slow them down. We can make them pay for every step they take. There was a long silence. The people exchanged uncertain looks, torn between fear and the flicker of something else. Hope. Finally, the man lowered his spear slightly. If you're serious about this, you'll need more than just talk. You'll need to find others willing to fight. Edric nodded. Then that's what we'll do. Back at the ridge, the group waited anxiously until Edric returned with the villagers following him. Olwen's eyes widened when she saw them, and for the first time in days, a faint smile crossed her face. By the time the sun began to set, the two groups sat together around a small fire, sharing food and stories of the raids. Some had lost everything. Others had managed to escape with only what they carried, but all shared the same anger. It was quiet, simmering just beneath the surface, but it was there. That night, as the others rested, Edric sat awake again, staring at the fire. The older man sat beside him, watching him carefully. "You've started something," he said. Edric nodded slowly. "It has to start somewhere." Far across the sea, the longship creaked as it cut through the waves under the pale light of the moon. Bjorn sat near the edge, sharpening his axe slowly, his mind heavy with what had happened at the last raid. The woman they had taken haunted him, her terrified face refusing to leave his thoughts. Rold paced the deck like a restless wolf, his eyes scanning the crew. Bjorn could feel his gaze lingering on him from time to time, sharp and suspicious. The younger raiders sat in clusters, laughing and boasting about the silver they had taken, but the laughter felt distant to Bjorn, almost hollow. Every word of it grated against him now. One of the younger men, the same boy who had spoken to him before, approached, sitting beside him. "You were quiet again today," the boy said. "Are you worried about something?" Bjorn kept his eyes on the blade of his axe. "Just thinking." The boy grinned, as if trying to lighten the mood. "Rold says we'll be legends after this season. Think about it. People will sing our names." Bjorn glanced at him, his face unreadable. "Songs don't matter much to the dead." The boy frowned slightly, but said nothing. After a moment, he returned to the others, leaving Bjorn alone again. Rold approached soon after, his steps deliberate. He crouched near Bjorn, his grin sharp. "You fought well enough today, but I see it in you. Doubt, hesitation. That kind of thing spreads if you're not careful." Bjorn didn't look up. "I do what's needed." Rold tilted his head, studying him. "For now." His voice dropped lower, quieter. "Don't make me wonder where your loyalty lies, Bjorn. You know what happens to men who choose the wrong side." Bjorn's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone calm. "I know." Rold gave a slow smile, then stood, walking away, but the warning lingered in the air like smoke. Bjorn stared at the sea, his hands tightening around the axe handle. He couldn't keep this up forever. The next raid was coming, and soon he'd have to decide whether to keep playing the part or risk everything. And miles away, in the quiet of the forest, Edric looked at the small group gathered around the fire, his family, the survivors, and now these new allies. For the first time, the fear in their eyes seemed mixed with something else. Determination. Both men, though worlds apart, felt the same weight pressing on them. The time for running was ending. And soon, whether by choice or by fate, their paths would collide. The forest air felt heavier now, as if it sensed the weight of what was coming. Edric stood at the edge of the clearing, watching the small group of survivors who had gathered under his quiet leadership. There were more of them now, men and women from different villages, all scarred by raids, all carrying the same anger he felt. They were farmers, fishermen, hunters, even children old enough to carry simple weapons. Crude spears had been carved from branches, axes sharpened on stones, and pits were being dug along narrow forest paths. Every night, they trained in silence, learning how to move quietly, how to strike quickly and vanish. It wasn't much, not compared to the strength of Viking raiders, but it was something. Every trap they laid, every step they took made the idea of fighting feel less like a dream and more like a real chance. Edric moved among them, correcting a man's grip on a spear, showing a young boy how to stay low while moving through the trees. His face stayed calm, but inside, tension pulled at him constantly. This was no longer just about surviving. This was about standing against men who were stronger, faster, and trained to kill. He knew the cost would be high. He only hoped it wouldn't take everything from them. Olwen approached, her face lined with worry but steady. "You've changed," she said softly, her voice low enough so no one else could hear. Edric looked at her, his jaw tight. "We've all changed." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Just don't forget why you're doing this. Not for revenge. For them." Her eyes shifted toward their children, who sat by the fire, the little boy trying to whittle a stick while his sister watched. Edric's gaze softened. "I haven't forgotten." That night, as the group rested, Edric stood alone in the trees, his eyes scanning the dark forest. The traps they had set were ready, the narrow paths cleared for ambushes. He didn't know when the Vikings would come, but he could feel it pressing closer with every breath. Across the sea, The longship cut through dark waters under a cloudy sky. Bjorn sat at the front, his grip tight on his axe, his mind churning with unease. The crew had grown restless, eager for the next raid. Rold moved among them, his presence sharp and commanding, his grin as dangerous as ever. The coastline ahead was quiet, the kind of place that should have been easy prey, but something about it felt different. Bjorn stared at the dark tree line, his instincts prickling. Something was waiting there. The ship slid onto the shore with a dull scrape, the raiders jumping out, their boots crunching against the wet sand. Rold barked orders, sending groups into the trees and toward the distant smoke of a settlement. Bjorn moved slower than the others, his eyes scanning the forest edge. The quiet felt wrong. Too still, too controlled. He tightened his grip on his axe, his heart beating faster. One of the younger raiders ran past him, laughing as he headed toward the trees. But before he could take 5 steps, the ground gave way beneath him with a sharp crack. A pit trap. His scream was short, cut off as wooden spikes tore into him. Shouts erupted as more raiders stumbled into hidden snares, ropes snapping tight around their legs, pulling them off balance. Arrows hissed from the trees, crude but effective, striking men in the chaos. Bjorn's chest tightened as he looked toward the forest. He could barely see them, but he knew they were there, villagers, survivors fighting back. And in that moment, he understood exactly who they were fighting for. Rold roared with fury, his voice cutting through the chaos. Find them. Drag them out of those trees. He swung his axe wildly, his face twisted with rage. Bjorn moved quickly, dodging through the confusion, but his mind raced. He could join the others, charge into the trees, and cut down people who had already lost everything. Or he could do something far more dangerous. One of the younger raiders turned toward him, shouting, "Bjorn, come on. They're just farmers." Bjorn's jaw tightened. Farmers. Families. People like the fishermen in the woods. People who didn't deserve this. His fingers tightened around his axe, his heart pounding harder with every scream that rose from the forest. Inside the trees, Edric crouched low, watching through the branches as the chaos unfolded. His traps had worked, at least for now, slowing them, scattering them. But he knew it wouldn't last. These men were used to blood. They would recover quickly. He motioned to the others, whispering sharply, "Wait for my signal. Stay hidden until they're closer." The villagers crouched among the trees, their weapons tight in their hands, their breathing fast. Some trembled, but none moved away. Edric's eyes scanned the raiders, trying to find the leader, the one who commanded them. If they could take him down, maybe the rest would falter. Then he saw him, broad-shouldered, moving through the chaos like a wolf among sheep. His voice was loud, his strikes quick and deadly. Edric's jaw tightened. That had to be the one. Alwyn crouched beside him, her voice low. "Do you think we can stop them?" Edric's eyes stayed locked on the leader. "We have to." Back near the shore, Bjorn's heart pounded as he watched Rold storm toward the forest, his rage growing with every step. The villagers were fighting back, desperate and clever, but Rold wouldn't stop until every one of them was dead. Bjorn took a slow breath, his mind racing. This was it, the moment he had been trying to avoid, the moment where standing still would mean choosing the wrong side. The younger raider from before ran past him again, laughing as he charged into the trees. Bjorn watched him for a split second, then moved, grabbing the boy's arm and pulling him back sharply. "What are you doing?" the boy shouted, shocked. Bjorn didn't answer. He stared into the forest, his chest tight, his fingers gripping his axe, so hard his knuckles turned white. Inside the trees, Edric raised his hand, signaling his people. The raiders were coming closer now, drawn by rage, charging straight into the narrow paths they had prepared. The villagers shifted, spears ready, bows drawn, hearts pounding. The air felt thick, every sound amplified. The crunch of boots, the snap of branches, the rapid breaths of men and women about to fight for everything they had left. And just as the first raider broke through the trees, Edric gave the signal. The forest erupted. The traps sprang to life. Spears lunged forward, and shouts filled the air. The raiders, caught off guard, stumbled into the chaos, their formation breaking apart. Edric moved fast, his spear striking at one raider, pushing him back before vanishing deeper into the trees. Alwyn fought beside him, her movements quick and precise, her fear drowned out by determination. But through it all, Edric's eyes stayed locked on the leader, the one man who could turn this entire battle. And across the clearing, Bjorn stepped into the edge of the trees, his axe raised, his chest heaving. His eyes scanned the chaos, landing on the villagers for the first time. Among them, he saw a familiar face, the fisherman from the forest. Their eyes met for a brief, electric moment, recognition flashing between them. Bjorn's heart pounded harder. His grip tightened, and for the first time, he knew he had to choose. The roar of battle swelled around them, the air thick with shouts and the clash of weapons. The tension built higher, every second pulling them closer to the breaking point, where one choice would change everything. The clash was only beginning. The forest became a storm of noise and motion, a blur of shouts, the clash of metal, and the heavy thud of boots against the earth. The villagers fought like people with nothing left to lose, darting between trees, striking fast, then vanishing again. Spears jabbed from behind bushes, arrows hissed through the air, and traps snapped shut on legs and arms, dragging raiders down into the dirt. Edric moved through it all, his body tense but focused. His spear was slick with sweat as he thrust it into a raider's side, forcing the man back before slipping away into the shadows. He had no illusions. This wasn't a fair fight. The raiders were stronger, better armed, and far more experienced. But the forest was theirs, and every step the raiders took was a risk. Keep them moving toward the ridge, Edric shouted, his voice carrying just enough to reach the villagers closest to him. The ridge was narrow, with steep drops on either side, perfect for funneling the raiders into a single line where their numbers wouldn't matter as much. Alwyn stayed close, her face set in grim determination. She had armed herself with a short spear, and though her strikes were quick and cautious, there was no hesitation in her movements anymore. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for their children, for the life they had lost, for something better than endless running. The raiders roared in frustration, their usual swift victories replaced with confusion and rage. Men cursed as they stumbled into traps, their boots snapping ropes that pulled them into pits where their legs caught by crude snares. But for every raider who fell, two more pushed forward, hacking at branches, driving deeper into the forest. And at the center of it all was Rold, his fury unmatched. He swung his axe like a man possessed, his roars cutting through the chaos. Two villagers rushed him at once, their spears lunging for his chest, but he sidestepped with terrifying speed, his axe sweeping in a brutal arc that sent one man crashing to the ground. His laughter rang out, cruel and sharp. Edric spotted him through the shifting shadows. His heart pounded harder as he crouched low, studying the man. Rold was exactly what he had expected, a fighter who thrived in the chaos, who terrified everyone around him. If they couldn't stop him, the others might break. Alwyn followed his gaze, her breath quickening. "You can't fight him alone," she whispered, her voice tight. Edric's jaw tightened. "I'm not going to fight him alone. I just need to separate him from the others." He signaled to two villagers nearby, gesturing toward the ridge. They nodded quickly, vanishing into the trees to circle around. Meanwhile, at the edge of the forest, Bjorn moved slower than the other raiders, his chest tight as he watched the chaos unfold. The villagers were fighting with desperation, but also with strategy. Every trap, every strike felt deliberate, planned. And then he saw him again, the fisherman from before. Edric. Their eyes locked for a second across the clearing, and it was like the entire battle froze for Bjorn. The memory of that day in the forest flooded back. The way Edric had held his son close, the silent plea in his eyes. Bjorn's heart thudded hard. He had come here to raid, to take and destroy like always, but now, watching these villagers fight back, he felt something shift inside him. "Bjorn!" Rold's voice cut through his thoughts like a blade. "Get in there. Drive them back." Bjorn hesitated, his fingers tightening on his axe. Rold's orders were clear, but so was the weight pressing on his chest. He looked toward Edric again, who was moving fast through the trees, spear in hand, eyes locked on Rold. And in that moment, Bjorn made a choice. He moved, but not toward the villagers. Instead, he angled himself closer to Rold, weaving through the chaos. His mind raced. If he could slow Rold down, if he could give the villagers even a small advantage, maybe they had a chance. Edric darted between trees, his heart pounding as he closed in on Rold. The raider leader was cutting through his people like they were nothing, and every second he stayed on his feet, more lives would be lost. Alwyn moved behind Edric, her breath sharp but steady, ready to follow his lead. The ridge was close now. 2 villagers had already lured part of the raider group toward the narrow path, shouting taunts as they ran, drawing the raiders exactly where they wanted them. Rold, furious, turned his attention toward them, stomping forward like a bull charging its prey. His focus was locked on the ridge, his back momentarily exposed. Edric tensed, gripping his spear tighter, ready to strike. But then something unexpected happened. Bjorn stepped in front of Rold, his axe raised, blocking his path. Rold stopped, his eyes narrowing, confusion flashing across his face. "What are you doing?" Bjorn's grip tightened. His heart pounded so loud he could barely hear the chaos around them. "You're walking into a trap," he said, his voice steady but low. Rold barked a sharp laugh. "A trap? They're farmers. Do you think I care about their tricks? Get out of my way, Bjorn." Bjorn didn't move. His chest rose and fell, his mind screaming at him to do something, to say something, but all he could do was stand there, refusing to step aside. Rold's grin twisted into something darker. "Move," he said again, his tone cold now. And still, Bjorn didn't move. Edric crouched lower in the trees, watching the exchange with wide eyes. He hadn't expected this. Not from a raider, not from a man who had spared him before. The tension between the 2 men hung in the air like a drawn bowstring. Rold's knuckles tightened around his axe handle, his fury rising fast. "Are you choosing them?" Rold asked, his voice quieter now, but far more dangerous. Bjorn's jaw tightened, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then, finally, he answered, "Yes." The single word hit the air like a strike, and Rold's grin disappeared, replaced by a sharp, murderous rage. Around them, the battle raged on, the villagers pushing closer to the ridge, the raiders beginning to falter under the constant strikes and traps. But in that one clearing, everything slowed as the 2 men stared each other down. Edric gripped his spear tighter, his breath catching as he watched. If Bjorn fought Rold, it could change everything. But if he lost, Rold let out a low laugh, his expression twisting. "Then you're a dead man, Bjorn." And with that, he lunged. Bjorn barely had time to raise his axe as Rold's strike came down with brutal force, the clash of steel ringing through the trees. Edric's heart raced as he crouched lower, watching the 2 raiders clash. The rest of the villagers hadn't noticed yet, too busy fighting for their lives, but this fight, this single fight, might decide everything. Bjorn blocked another swing, his arms straining against Rold's strength, his teeth clenched. He had fought beside this man for years, knew his every move, but Rold was stronger, faster, and driven by pure rage. Edric moved closer, staying low, his eyes locked on the fight. If Bjorn fell, Rold would tear through them all. But if there was even a chance to strike at the right moment. The forest roared with the sound of battle as the 2 men fought, each strike sending sparks from their weapons, each movement a blur of strength and desperation. And somewhere, just beyond the trees, Alwyn whispered to herself, clutching her spear tighter. Everything was building to this moment. One choice, one strike, could change the course of all their lives. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring, seconds away from snapping. The clash between Bjorn and Rold grew more violent with every strike, each blow echoing through the trees like a drum of war. Sparks flew when their axes collided, wood splintered under their boots, and their grunts of effort cut through the distant shouts of the ongoing battle. Neither man yielded an inch, but it was clear to anyone watching, Rold was the stronger of the 2. His swings were heavy and merciless, forcing Bjorn backward step by step. Edric crouched low in the shadows, his eyes locked on the fight. Every strike, every movement told him how dangerous this man was. Rold fought like a predator who had never lost, his movements quick and confident despite his size. Bjorn, on the other hand, was fighting with something else, determination, but also restraint, as if every strike was weighed, as if he didn't want to kill unless he had to. Rold's laughter was sharp and cruel as he pressed forward, swinging his axe in wide arcs. "You've gone soft, Bjorn." Was it their pleading eyes? Their screaming children? "Have you forgotten what we are?" Bjorn's jaw tightened, his grip firm as he blocked another blow. "I haven't forgotten," he said, his voice steady even as sweat streaked down his face. "I just stopped pretending that slaughter makes us men." Rold's grin twisted into something far darker. "Then you're no Viking at all. You're nothing." With a roar, Rold swung hard, his axe coming down with a force that rattled through Bjorn's arms. Bjorn staggered back, his boots slipping slightly on the damp forest ground, but he caught himself before he could fall. Edric could feel his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. He had never seen two men fight like this, every strike heavy enough to shatter bone, every movement fast and dangerous. But what held him frozen wasn't just the violence. It was the fact that this raider, this man who had spared him once, was fighting against his own kind to protect them. The villagers around the ridge hadn't noticed yet. They were too busy holding the raiders back. Olwen, crouched beside a fallen tree, caught sight of Bjorn and her eyes widened. "Is he helping us?" she whispered. Edric didn't answer. His eyes stayed fixed on Rold, waiting for an opening, a single moment where he could make a move. Bjorn gritted his teeth, parrying another strike before lunging forward, his axe swinging toward Rold's side. Rold twisted at the last second, the blade slicing across his arm, but not deep enough to stop him. Blood streaked down his sleeve, but his grin only widened. "You think you can beat me, Bjorn?" Rold snarled, stepping closer, his voice low and dangerous. "You're already dead. You just haven't fallen yet." Bjorn didn't reply. His breaths came heavier now, his arms beginning to ache under the constant force of Rold's strikes. Every move he made was measured, trying to tire Rold out, but Rold's rage seemed endless. Edric tightened his grip on his spear, leaning forward slightly. His mind raced. If Bjorn could keep Rold distracted just a little longer, maybe he could end this. But the wrong move could get both of them killed. Another heavy swing came, and this time, Bjorn barely managed to block it. Rold pushed forward with brutal force, shoving him back until his shoulder hit a tree. The impact knocked the air from his chest, and for a split second, his defenses lowered. Rold saw it instantly. With a roar, he raised his axe high, aiming for Bjorn's head. Edric moved without thinking. He darted forward from the shadows, his spear lunging with all the strength he had. The point drove into Rold's side, just below his ribs. Rold roared in pain, twisting sharply, his axe swinging toward Edric now. Edric barely jumped back in time, the blade slicing the air where his head had been a moment ago. Bjorn didn't hesitate. He pushed off the tree, swinging his axe in a sharp arc that struck Rold's injured side. The blow landed hard, forcing Rold to stagger, his expression twisting with fury and pain. But even wounded, Rold didn't fall. His roar shook the air as he turned, striking wildly at both men, his movements now driven by pure rage. Edric ducked under a swing, rolling to the side, his spear clutched tight. Bjorn met Rold's next strike head-on, the force rattling through his arms as their axes locked together. The battle around them had begun to slow as raiders and villagers alike turned their heads, drawn by the sight of their leader fighting one of his own. Murmurs rippled through the raiders, confusion spreading like a crack in stone. Olwen, still crouched near the ridge, whispered sharply to the villagers around her. "Keep pressing. Push them toward the traps." The villagers rallied, striking harder now, sensing the shift in the raiders' focus. Some raiders faltered, hesitating as they watched the fight between Bjorn and Rold unfold. Rold, furious at the distraction, slammed his forehead into Bjorn's, forcing him back a step. "Traitor," he spat, his voice raw with fury. Bjorn wiped the blood from his brow, his breathing heavy but his gaze steady. "Maybe," he said, "but not a coward." He lunged forward again, his axe swinging in a fast, desperate strike. Rold blocked it, but his movements were slower now, his injured side weakening him. Edric circled around, his spear ready, his heart pounding as he looked for another opening. He wasn't a warrior. He knew that, but this fight wasn't about skill. It was about who could hold on longer, who refused to give up. Rold swung again, his roar echoing through the forest, but his strike missed as Bjorn dodged to the side. Edric seized the moment, thrusting his spear again, this time deeper into Rold's side. The raider leader roared, his axe swinging blindly toward Edric. The fisherman jumped back, but the blade grazed his arm, slicing through cloth and skin. Pain shot through him, but he held his ground, his spear still locked in Rold's side. Bjorn raised his axe high, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on Rold's neck. This was the moment. But before he could strike, Rold let out a deafening roar, twisting sharply, ripping the spear from his side as he swung his axe in a wild arc. The blade slammed against Bjorn's side, knocking him backward into the dirt. Edric's breath caught as Bjorn hit the ground, his axe falling from his hand. Rold turned toward him now, blood streaking his face but his eyes burning with fury. The raider leader staggered forward, his steps uneven but his strength still terrifying. "You should have stayed in the dirt, fisherman," he growled, raising his axe. Edric tightened his grip on his spear, his breathing sharp and fast. His arm ached from the cut, his legs felt heavy, but he didn't move back. The forest went silent for a split second, the tension so thick it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Rold roared again, swinging his axe down toward Edric. And then, just before the blade struck, Bjorn moved. With a burst of strength, he lunged from the ground, his hand gripping his fallen axe as he swung upward with everything he had left. The sound of the strike echoed through the trees. Rold froze, his eyes wide, his axe still raised. The battle hung on that single moment. Every villager, every raider watching as the leader's roar choked into silence. The tension had reached its peak, and now, in the blink of an eye, everything was about to change. Rold stood frozen for a heartbeat, his axe still raised high, his eyes wide with shock. Bjorn's strike had landed clean, cutting deep across his side. Blood soaked through the raider leader's tunic, his breath coming in ragged bursts. But instead of falling, Rold's mouth twisted into something far more dangerous than pain, a grin. He staggered backward, one knee dipping slightly, but then, with a roar that sent a chill through the trees, he straightened again. His eyes burned with something wild, something that refused to break, even with a wound that would have felled most men. Bjorn's chest heaved as he gripped his axe tighter, preparing for the final blow, but before he could move, Rold swung his own weapon in a sudden, vicious arc. Bjorn blocked, but the force sent him stumbling back, boots skidding through the dirt. Edric froze for a split second, disbelief rushing through him. Rold should have been finished, but he wasn't. He was fighting harder, faster, as if the injury only fueled his rage. The villagers, who had begun to push forward with renewed hope, hesitated at the sight. Some faltered, stepping back, their faces pale with fear. The raiders, who moments ago looked uncertain, let out a cheer at their leader's defiance, rallying to his roar. Rold turned his gaze on Bjorn, his grin sharp and dangerous. "You think you've won, boy?" he snarled, his voice rough and mocking. "You're still just a fool swinging a blade. You've forgotten what it means to be one of us." Bjorn steadied himself, his jaw tight, but he said nothing. His eyes stayed locked on Rold, his chest rising and falling in quick, heavy breaths. Edric crouched low, shifting his grip on the spear. He couldn't just watch. If Rold pushed back now, the entire battle could turn in an instant. Then, just as Bjorn moved forward to strike again, a sharp whistle cut through the forest. Everyone, raiders, villagers, even Rold, turned toward the sound. From the trees on the far side of the ridge, more figures emerged, moving fast through the shadows. They weren't villagers, and they weren't part of Rold's group either. Their armor was different, their movements more organized, and their weapons glinted in the dying light. Edric's stomach dropped, as realization hit. These weren't survivors, they were more raiders. Reinforcements. Rold let out a sharp laugh, the sound echoing through the chaos. "You didn't think we came alone, did you?" he said, his voice booming over the renewed shouting. The villagers' faces paled as the new group stormed into the clearing, their weapons raised. The traps they had set wouldn't be enough for this many, and panic rippled through their ranks. Edric turned sharply to Alwyn, who stood near the ridge, clutching her spear. "Get them back," he shouted. "Fall to the ridge, now." Alwyn nodded quickly, her voice rising to rally the villagers. But some were too slow, too shocked by the sudden turn. The new raiders crashed into their lines, cutting through hastily raised defenses. Bjorn's head whipped toward the newcomers, his expression tightening. Rold's grin widened at the sight, his confidence surging. "This is over," Rold growled, turning back to Bjorn, his axe raised. "You're done, traitor." Bjorn took a step forward, his grip tight, but Edric could see it now. Bjorn was tiring, his strength fading after the long fight. Rold, despite his wound, still moved with the fury of a man who refused to fall. Edric clenched his jaw, his mind racing. They couldn't hold the ridge if the reinforcements broke through. And if Rold stayed standing, the villagers will the fight would shatter completely. But then, as chaos swirled around them, something unexpected happened. One of the new raiders, a younger man with a scarred face, hesitated as he stepped into the clearing. His eyes darted between the villagers and Bjorn, then landed on Rold. His grip on his sword faltered slightly. Bjorn noticed, his voice cutting through the noise. "You don't have to follow him," he shouted, his tone sharp, desperate. "Look around you. This isn't a battle, it's slaughter. These people are just defending their homes." The young raider froze, his expression torn. Rold's roar snapped his attention back, but doubt flickered in his eyes. Another raider slowed, glancing at Bjorn with the same hesitation. The shift was small, barely noticeable in the chaos, but it was there. Edric's heart pounded harder as he realized what Bjorn was doing. He wasn't just fighting, he was trying to turn them. Rold saw it too, and his face twisted with rage. "Don't listen to him," he roared at his men. "He's nothing but a coward who's forgotten who he is." But the doubt spread like a crack in ice. Two raiders stepped back slightly, glancing at each other, their grips on their weapons loosening. Rold lunged toward Bjorn, his fury spilling over. "I'll kill you myself before you poison their heads." Bjorn braced himself, raising his axe to block. The two clashed again, their weapons striking with bone-rattling force. Edric used the distraction, darting forward to help. He lunged at Rold's back, forcing the raider leader to twist and block, his attention split between them now. The villagers, seeing Bjorn fighting Rold and sensing the hesitation among the new raiders, rallied once more. Alwyn shouted orders, pushing them to hold the ridge, their movements sharper now, fueled by renewed determination. But the reinforcements were still strong, and the ridge was dangerously close to being overrun. Rold roared again, his strikes faster, more desperate now. "You'll die for this, Bjorn," he snarled, his axe swinging in a deadly arc. Bjorn gritted his teeth, blocking with all his strength. "Not before you," he said, his voice low but steady. The clash grew fiercer, the forest trembling with every strike. And as the two men fought, as villagers and raiders struggled on the ridge, the outcome balanced on a knife's edge. The stakes had never been higher. One mistake, one wrong move, and everything they had fought for would crumble. And in that moment, as Rold swung again, Bjorn shifted his stance, readying for one final, desperate move. But just as he did, a sharp horn call echoed from somewhere deep in the forest, a sound none of them expected. Every head turned toward the trees. The horns sounded again, closer this time, and then movement flickered among the shadows. Figures emerged, not raiders, not villagers, but something else entirely. Edric's heart leapt into his throat as he realized what this meant. Whoever they weren't here by accident. And as the horn blew again, louder now, the forest itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next strike that would decide everything. The horn call echoed again, deep and resonant, cutting through the chaos like a blade. Every fighter, Villager, raider, and even Bjorn hesitated for a heartbeat, their heads turning toward the sound. The forest felt alive with it, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then the underbrush rustled. More figures emerged from the dense shadows, moving in formation, not like scattered raiders or desperate villagers. There was precision in the way they stepped, the way they carried their weapons, and it sent a shiver through Edric. These weren't farmers, nor were they Rold's reinforcements. The first figure stepped into the clearing, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a mix of leather and iron that looked battered from travel but sturdy enough for battle. A wolf pelt hung across his shoulders, its head still attached, staring lifelessly ahead. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes burned with the same fierce determination Edric had seen in Bjorn's, only colder. More followed, forming a loose semicircle around the edge of the battle. Their shields bore no single symbol, some carved with runes, others with strange markings. They didn't shout, they didn't charge. They just watched, their presence heavy and commanding, as if weighing the scene before deciding who their enemy truly was. Rold's grin faltered for the first time, a flash of recognition crossing his face. "No," he muttered under his breath, his grip tightening on his axe. Then, louder, he snarled, "This is my raid. You have no claim here." The wolf-pelted man tilted his head slightly, his calm voice carrying across the clearing. "You've grown sloppy, Rold, taking too much, leaving nothing behind but fire. You've forgotten the old ways." The words landed like stones. Some of Rold's own men exchanged uneasy glances. A few of the new raiders, Rold's reinforcements, shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the newcomers and what they represented. Bjorn's chest tightened. He knew them. Every Viking did. These were not simple raiders. They were an older, stricter kind, men who still followed the older codes of raiding, where honor, not mindless slaughter, determined a leader's worth. Rold's face twisted in anger. "You think you can come here and tell me how to raid? You're nothing but scavengers living in the past." The wolf-pelted man didn't flinch. His gaze shifted briefly to Bjorn, and for a heartbeat, something passed between them, recognition, maybe even respect. Then his voice cut through the tension. "You've broken too many oaths, Rold. This ends now." The clearing erupted with new noise as the wolf-pelted man raised his hand, signaling his warriors forward. For a split second, nobody moved. The villagers froze, unsure whether these newcomers were friends or enemies. Rold's raiders hesitated, some stepping back, torn between loyalty and fear. Then the wolf-pelted warriors charged. The battle exploded again, fiercer than before, but now the chaos had shifted. Rold roared with fury, swinging his axe wildly as his own men scrambled to decide whether to fight beside him or drop their weapons. Some turned and fled toward the ridge, their courage broken. Others raised their weapons, clashing with the newcomers in a desperate attempt to protect their leader. Edric crouched low, pulling Olwen toward the ridge. "Keep the villagers back," he ordered. "Let them fight each other." Olwen's face was pale, but she nodded quickly, calling to the villagers to hold their position. Some wanted to run, others wanted to join the fight, but the smarter choice was clear: let the raiders tear themselves apart. Bjorn stayed where he was, chest heaving as he watched Rold fight like a cornered beast. Their eyes met again across the clearing, and for a moment, Bjorn wondered if he should finish what he started. But before he could move, the wolf-pelted man closed in, his axe swinging with brutal precision. Rold blocked, his roar echoing through the trees. "Cowards," he spat. "All of you." The wolf-pelted man didn't reply. His movements were steady, every strike deliberate, wearing Rold down. Edric's spear tightened in his hands as he watched. He wanted to end it himself, to strike at the man who had burned their homes and taken everything. But this fight had shifted beyond him now. It was between Bjorn, Rold, and these new arrivals who had their own reasons for being here. Bjorn stepped forward finally, his axe raised, moving toward Rold with steady determination. The wolf-pelted man's eyes flicked to him, but didn't stop him. Rold's attention snapped to Bjorn, his face twisted with rage. "You," he snarled, swinging at him in a blind fury. "You betray me for them? For farmers. Bjorn blocked, the force rattling through his arms. I betray you because you've forgotten who we were supposed to be, he said, his voice steady despite his exhaustion. Rold lunged again, but his strikes were slower now, his strength faltering from his injuries. Bjorn sidestepped, his axe cutting across Rold's arm. Blood sprayed, and Rold stumbled. The wolf-pelted man moved in closer, ready to finish it, but Bjorn raised a hand, his eyes locked on Rold. He's mine, he said firmly. The older warrior paused, then stepped back slightly, giving Bjorn space. The two men faced each other, the forest silent except for the distant sounds of battle as raiders fought among themselves. Edric's breath caught. Every villager, every fighter seemed to hold still, watching. This was the moment everything hinged on. Rold roared one last time, charging at Bjorn, his axe raised high. Bjorn didn't back away. He stepped forward instead, his movements sharp and precise, his axe swinging in a fast arc. But just as the blade came down, a sharp crack split the air. An arrow flew from the tree-line, striking the ground between them. Both men froze, turning toward the trees. A new group stepped into view, moving with quiet purpose. They weren't raiders, nor were they villagers. Their clothes were different, rougher, more travel-worn, and their weapons were bows, not axes. Their faces were hidden by hoods, their steps careful but confident. Edric's stomach tightened as he watched them. Whoever they were, they didn't look like they were here to help either side. One of the hooded figures lowered his bow slightly, his voice calm but firm. This fight ends now. Too much blood has already been spilled. The words hung in the air, cutting through the tension. Rold snarled, still gripping his axe, but even he hesitated, his eyes darting toward the newcomers. Bjorn straightened, his breathing heavy, his grip still tight on his weapon, but his eyes stayed on the hooded figure. "Who are you?" he demanded. The hooded man didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward slowly, his eyes scanning the clearing, taking in the villagers, the wounded, and the raiders who had fallen silent. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but carrying weight. "We're not here for you," he said. "We're here for him." He pointed, not at Rold, not at Bjorn, but straight at Edric. The forest seemed to go still again, every gaze snapping to the fisherman-turned-leader who froze in shock. Olwen's breath caught as she stepped closer to him. "Edric, why?" she whispered, fear creeping into her voice. Edric's heart pounded as he stared at the hooded figures, confusion and dread twisting in his chest. And as the forest held its breath once more, the real question loomed heavier than ever. What could they possibly want with him? Edric stood frozen as every eye in the clearing turned toward him. His chest tightened, his mind racing to understand why these strangers, who had just walked into a battlefield, would be here for him, of all people. The hooded figure didn't move, his bow lowered but ready, his calm gaze fixed on Edric like a hunter cornering prey. Olwen stepped closer to him, her hand gripping his arm. "Edric," she whispered urgently, "what do they mean? Why you?" "I don't know," he said quietly, though his voice carried enough for others to hear. And it was true. At least, he wanted it to be true. But deep inside, a memory stirred, one he had buried for years. Rold let out a sharp, mocking laugh, blood streaking his side as he leaned on his axe for balance. "Of course," he said hoarsely, his grin curling with cruel satisfaction. "The fisherman with too many clever traps, too many plans. It makes sense now." Bjorn shot him a glare, stepping protectively between Rold and Edric, though his expression turned to confusion when he looked back at the fisherman. "What are they talking about?" The hooded figure stepped forward slowly, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "You're not just a fisherman, are you, Edric? You were once one of us. You fought for silver, not for a village. You were a raider long before you pretended to be a farmer." Gasps rippled through the villagers, some stepping back, their faces paling. Olwen's grip on his arm tightened, her voice trembling. "Is that true?" Edric's heart pounded as every gaze pressed on him. He wanted to deny it, to stay the man he had become, not the man he had been. But the truth sat heavy on his chest, and there was no point lying anymore. "I left that life," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. I walked away years ago. I wanted something better. A family. A life that didn't depend on stealing from others. The hooded man's eyes narrowed slightly. You walked away, but you still owe blood. You swore loyalty to a crew and broke it. The oaths don't forget, even if you do. Rold let out another laugh, though it was broken by a cough. So that's it. The great fisherman is just a coward who ran from the life. All of this, he gestured weakly to the battlefield, wasn't for them. It was for yourself. Bjorn's jaw tightened, but he didn't lower his axe. He's not the same man anymore. You can see that. The hooded figure's gaze stayed locked on Edric. That doesn't matter. Oaths are oaths. We didn't come to kill you, Edric, but you have to come with us. Alwyn stepped in front of him now, her voice shaking but firm. No, he's not going anywhere. He's one of us. Whatever he did before, he's our leader now, and he's saved us. The villagers murmured in agreement, some raising their spears again despite their fear. The hooded figure looked around, his expression unreadable. If he stays, more will come for him. The raiders, the old crews, they won't stop. You think this ends with Rold? It doesn't. Bjorn's eyes shifted between Edric and the hooded man, his grip tightening on his axe. If he goes, will you leave the village in peace? The hooded man nodded once. We will, but he has to come willingly. The forest went quiet, the weight of the choice pressing down on all of them. Edric looked at Alwyn, her eyes wide with fear, and then at Bjorn, who stood tense and ready to fight if needed. Edric's chest rose and fell slowly as he looked at the villagers who had followed him, who had trusted him. He could see it in their faces. They wanted him to stay, but they also knew the truth of the hooded man's words. If he stayed, more raiders would come, and maybe next time, they wouldn't survive. Finally, Edric took a deep breath and stepped forward. I'll go, he said quietly. Alwyn's hand shot out, gripping his arm tightly. No, Edric, don't do this. We need you. He turned to her, his voice soft but firm. You don't need me. You've proven you can fight, all of you. You can protect yourselves now. He hesitated, his voice lowering even more. And if I stay, you'll always be in danger because of me. Alwyn's eyes welled with tears, but she didn't argue again. Bjorn stepped closer, his face conflicted. If you go, you may never come back, he said quietly. Edric gave him a faint, tired smile. I know. The hooded man nodded once, signaling to his group. They lowered their weapons slightly, giving Edric space to approach. But just as he took his first step toward them, Rold let out a roar. His face twisted with fury, his body shaking from blood loss but still driven by rage. You don't get to leave. Not after this. Before anyone could move, Rold lunged forward, his axe raised high, aiming straight for Edric. Bjorn reacted instantly, shoving Edric out of the way and swinging his axe in a fast, brutal arc. The two blades met in midair, sparks flying as Bjorn pushed forward with all his strength. Rold roared, trying to force him back, but his wounded side finally gave out. Bjorn twisted sharply, his axe cutting clean through Rold's chest. The raider leader staggered, his roar choking into silence as he collapsed onto the dirt, his axe falling from his hand. The clearing went still, the last sounds of fighting fading as the remaining raiders dropped their weapons or fled into the trees. Edric stared at Rold's motionless body, his chest tight. It was over. The man who had burned their homes, who had taken everything, was finally gone. The villagers let out a cheer, relief washing through them, but the mood remained heavy as they turned back to Edric. The hooded man stepped forward again, his voice calm. It's time. Edric nodded slowly, glancing one last time at Alwyn, who stood silent, her face pale but strong. Take care of them, he said softly. Bjorn put a hand on his shoulder, his voice low. You don't have to do this. Edric gave him a small smile. I do, but thank you for everything. He stepped toward the hooded men, his steps steady despite the weight in his chest. The villagers watched silently, some crying, others standing firm, as Edric disappeared into the trees with the strangers. The forest grew quiet again, the sounds of the battle fading into the distance. But just before the hooded group vanished completely, the leader turned his head slightly toward Bjorn, his voice quiet enough only for him to hear. "This isn't the end," he said. "You'll understand soon enough." Bjorn frowned, his chest tightening as the man disappeared into the shadows. He didn't know what he meant, but the unease in his stomach wouldn't go away. And as the villagers began to pick up their fallen and rebuild, a single thought lingered in Bjorn's mind like a shadow. Edric had left to protect them, but what if the danger he carried with him was only the beginning? The forest slowly quieted after the hooded figures disappeared with Edric, leaving only the distant crackle of smoldering fires and the low murmurs of exhausted villagers tending to the wounded. The air still smelled of iron and smoke, but now, instead of the sharp, frantic energy of battle, there was only the heavy weight of what had just happened. Bjorn stood near the edge of the ridge, his axe hanging loosely in his hand, his shoulders slumped. He stared at the trees where Edric had vanished, his mind racing with questions he couldn't answer. He had fought beside many men, but none had surprised him as much as Edric. A fisherman, a villager, someone who had claimed to have left the raiding life behind, yet he had led these people with more courage than many seasoned warriors Bjorn had known. Alwyn approached him slowly, her steps quiet, her face streaked with dirt and ash. She stopped beside him, her arms crossed tightly as if holding herself together. "Do you think he'll come back?" she asked, her voice soft but carrying a thread of hope. Bjorn didn't look at her, his gaze still locked on the darkened tree line. "I don't know," he admitted, but I think he knew what he was doing. He didn't look scared when he left, just determined. Alwyn lowered her gaze, her voice breaking slightly. "He did this for us. He left because of us." Bjorn finally turned to her, his expression calm but steady. "And that's exactly why you have to make sure it wasn't for nothing." She nodded, though tears glistened in her eyes. She brushed them away quickly, straightening her shoulders as other villagers gathered nearby. Around them, people were beginning to work despite their exhaustion. Some were carrying the wounded back toward what was left of the village. Others were gathering fallen weapons, stacking them in neat piles as if preparing for the possibility of another fight. The air was heavy with sorrow, but under it all was a quiet strength, a determination that hadn't been there before. Alwyn turned toward them, her voice rising as she spoke. "Edric trusted us to keep going, to protect each other. That's what we'll do. We'll rebuild. We'll make this village strong again. Strong enough so no one will ever think we're easy prey." The villagers murmured in agreement, some lifting their heads with renewed resolve. Bjorn watched them for a long moment, something stirring in his chest. He had raided dozens of villages in his lifetime, seen fear in the eyes of countless farmers, but this was different. These people had fought back, not just because they were desperate, but because they believed they could. And that belief had started with one man who had chosen to turn away from everything Bjorn himself had once believed in. He tightened his grip on his axe, his thoughts turning back to the hooded men who had taken Edric. Their leader's words echoed in his mind. "This isn't the end. You'll understand soon enough." A cold unease settled in his stomach. Bjorn finally spoke, his voice low but firm as he turned to Alwyn. "You'll need more than just courage to survive what's coming." The men who took Edric, they weren't simple bounty hunters. They had their own purpose, and if they went to this trouble to take him, they might come back. Alwyn looked at him, her brows furrowed. "You think there's still a threat to us?" Bjorn nodded slightly. "Not today, maybe not even soon. But men like that don't stop unless they get what they want. And whatever they want with Edric, it might reach back here one day." Alwyn's jaw tightened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she said quietly, "Then we'll be ready." Bjorn looked at her for a long moment, then nodded once. "I'll stay for now. Help you rebuild, teach your people how to fight properly. If raiders come again, you'll be able to hold your ground." A flicker of relief crossed Alwyn's face, but quickly faded into focus as she turned back to the villagers, giving orders, helping them organize. As night began to fall, the survivors worked quietly, tending to the wounded and gathering what food and supplies they could salvage. The fires from the earlier attack were nearly out, leaving behind blackened patches of earth and smoke that curled into the darkening sky. Bjorn sat alone near the edge of the clearing, sharpening his axe with slow, deliberate movements. His mind was far away, replaying every moment of the battle, every word Edric had spoken, and the strange tension that hung in the air when the hooded men had appeared. There had been something in the way their leader had looked at him, almost as if he had been expecting Bjorn to be there, as if Edric wasn't the only one they were watching. Bjorn set his axe down, staring into the distance. He had spent years living by the old Viking ways, raiding and taking what he wanted, believing that strength was the only truth. But now, sitting among the ruins of a village he had chosen to defend, he felt the weight of those choices differently. He didn't regret helping these people, but he knew the cost of defying his own kind. If word spread that Bjorn had fought against raiders, more than just Rold's men would come looking for him. And if the hooded men truly had deeper motives, his choice to stand with Edric might have already set something larger in motion. Alwyn approached quietly, sitting across from him. She watched him for a long moment before speaking. "You don't have to stay, you know. You've already done more for us than we could ever repay." Bjorn shook his head slightly. "I gave my word. And besides," he said after a pause, "I owe Edric that much." Alwyn looked down, her voice soft. "Do you think he'll survive with them?" Bjorn hesitated, then said quietly, "If anyone can survive, it's him. He's not the same man he once was, but that's what makes him stronger now." They sat in silence for a while, the sounds of the village slowly settling for the night around them. But as the stars began to scatter across the dark sky, Bjorn's gaze drifted once more to the forest, and that unease gnawed at him again. Somewhere out there, Edric was walking deeper into a world he had tried to leave behind, and Bjorn couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had fought so hard to protect this village wasn't just going to disappear quietly. The hooded leader's final words echoed again, colder this time. "This isn't the end." Bjorn's hand rested on the haft of his axe, his jaw tightening as he stared into the darkness. Whatever was coming, he would be ready. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the next time he saw Edric, it wouldn't be as an ally, and that thought unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. The night deepened, quiet except for the soft rustle of wind through the trees, but the tension hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. Some battles, Bjorn knew, didn't end with a single victory. And this one, whatever it truly was, had only just begun. The night settled heavy over the village, the stars flickering weakly above as smoke from the burned homes curled into the cool air. The sounds of work had quieted now, replaced by tired voices murmuring softly among the villagers who sat gathered around small fires. Children huddled close to their parents, some already asleep despite the lingering tension, while others stared wide-eyed into the flames, too shaken to rest. Bjorn sat apart from the group, sharpening his axe slowly, the rhythmic scrape of stone against metal a quiet reminder that peace, even now, might only be temporary. His mind replayed the day's events again and again. The clash of steel, Rold's final charge, and Edric's steady decision to leave with the hooded men. It was strange to think how quickly everything had changed. A village that had been little more than a target for raiders had stood its ground and survived. And it had survived because of Edric. Alwyn approached quietly, sitting near him without a word. She stared into the fire for a long while before finally speaking, her voice soft but steady. "The people are already talking about rebuilding. They want to stay here, Bjorn. They don't want to run anymore." Bjorn glanced at her, noting the quiet determination in her tone. Good. That's what he would have wanted. Her gaze dropped slightly, her hands tightening in her lap. "Do you think he's safe with them?" Bjorn hesitated, watching the sparks rise from the fire before answering. "Safe? Maybe for now. But those men didn't come here just to take him. They had a purpose, something bigger than this village. Edric, he wouldn't have gone with them unless he believed he had to." Alwyn nodded slowly, though the sadness in her eyes didn't fade. "He always said he just wanted a quiet life, and yet he gave it up to protect us." Bjorn set his axe aside, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. A quiet life doesn't stay quiet for men like him. No matter how far you run, the past finds you. But he made his choice, for you, for everyone here. That's the kind of man he is now. The words brought a faint smile to Alwyn's lips, though it was weighed down by grief. "I wish I'd told him how much he meant to us before he left." Bjorn looked at her, his expression softening. You'll get the chance again. Men like Edric don't disappear forever. She looked up, surprised at his certainty. He shrugged slightly. Call it a feeling. He didn't leave to die. He left to keep you safe. And someday, when it's done, he'll come back. The silence stretched between them for a moment, filled only by the soft crackle of the fire. Around them, the villagers began to drift off to sleep, curling up near the remaining walls of their homes or under makeshift shelters built from salvaged wood. There was fear still, but also a strange, quiet hope. They had survived what had felt impossible. By morning, the village looked less like a ruin and more like a place beginning to heal. Smoke rose from newly lit cooking fires, and people moved with purpose, clearing debris and repairing walls. Alwyn directed groups to gather supplies, her voice firm and sure now. She carried herself differently, stronger, like someone who had stepped into a role she hadn't expected to fill. Bjorn watched her for a while as he helped mend a broken fence. She moved among the people easily, offering encouragement, giving instructions, and smiling faintly when children ran past her. The villagers trusted her now as much as they had trusted Edric, and Bjorn knew that was what Edric had wanted, to leave them with someone who could lead when he couldn't. Later that day, as the sun began to dip, Bjorn sat at the ridge overlooking the forest. His axe rested at his side, his gaze fixed on the dark line of trees where Edric had disappeared. The hooded man's words still echoed in his mind, carrying a weight he couldn't shake. This isn't the end. He didn't know what they meant by that, but he knew enough of the old ways to understand that there was always another fight waiting beyond the horizon. The world was changing. He could feel it in the way men like Rold had started raiding without honor, in the way strangers with hidden agendas now walked into battles uninvited. Something was shifting in the balance of power, and whatever it was, Edric had just stepped into the middle of it. Bjorn picked up his axe, running a thumb along the sharpened edge. He had lived his life as a raider, taking what he wanted, believing strength alone ruled the world. But sitting here now, he felt something different stirring inside him. Strength hadn't saved this village. A fisherman had. A man who had chosen to fight for people instead of silver, who had chosen to walk away from the old ways even when they came back to claim him. For the first time in years, Bjorn wondered if maybe that was the real kind of strength, the kind he had never known until now. Alwyn approached him again, standing beside him as she followed his gaze toward the forest. "Do you think we'll ever see him again?" she asked quietly. Bjorn didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched the tree lean, as if expecting to see Edric walking back through it any moment. Finally, he said, "If I know anything about Edric, it's that he doesn't give up. Whatever those men want from him, he'll fight it. And when he's done, he'll come back. Maybe not soon, maybe not even in a year, but he'll come back." Alwyn gave a small, hopeful smile, her eyes brightening slightly at his words. They stood there together for a long while, the quiet stretching between them, but it wasn't the same heavy silence as before. It felt lighter now, as if the worst had passed, even if the future was still uncertain. As the last light of day faded, the villagers lit torches along the ridge, their glow warm against the growing darkness. The air was cool, carrying with it the scent of earth and smoke, but also something new, something that felt almost like peace. Bjorn sat back, resting his axe across his knees, his gaze still fixed on the forest. He didn't know what the future held, not for himself, not for Edric, and not for this village. But for now, they were safe. And for the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't felt since he was a boy. Hope. The night settled around them, quiet and calm. The stars scattered across the dark sky. Somewhere far beyond those trees, Edric was walking his own path, facing whatever waited for him. But here, in this small, scarred village, life had begun again. And that, Bjorn thought as he leaned back and looked up at the stars, was worth fighting for. The forest whispered softly in the breeze, as if carrying the faintest promise on the wind. Edric would return, and when he did, they would be ready.